Lord of Mystery. The Undead Don't Die from Passing Fire by author Ni Di Xun Zong chapter 176-190. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And those who want to support me, I have a Patreon channel, get early access to video on Patreon. Chapter 176, Time to Depart. Klein's expression turned serious, and he asked, "What kind of commission?" Ember tapped the table with his hand and slowly said, "If you depart from Pritz Harbor, you will pass by Demir Island on the way. On Demir Island, there is a person named Danitz, who is the first mate of Iceberg Admiral, one of the pirate generals. I need you to help me deliver a message to him, telling him to go back and find Iceberg Admiral and not wait for me on Demir Island anymore. And if you meet Iceberg Admiral, help me convey another message, telling her not to wait for me anymore." All right. Klein kept Ember's commission in mind and nodded solemnly. But at the same time, Klein's emotions were a bit strange. What did telling her not to wait for me anymore mean? What was going on between you two? Ember placed his palm on the table and gently pushed it towards Klein. "This is the reward." Klein looked closely and saw a pale branch lying on the table. Klein hesitated and asked, "What is this?" He looked at the tender white branch, but he couldn't be sure. Ember glanced at him and said, "Sacrifice twig, its effect is similar to the sacrifice ring." Klein's expression shifted slightly, and he pressed on. "What do you mean, similar effect?" Ember pondered for 2 seconds and explained concisely. "The sacrifice ring is made through a sacrifice ritual and can die in place of the wearer. The sacrifice twig is a branch left from trimming the golden tree, containing enormous vitality, and can resurrect you after your death." Klein's eye twitched. Sacrifice twig, golden tree, these were terms he had never heard of. These things were clearly not from the world of Dark Soul. Like Ember's ability to summon ash, they should come from other power systems. However, as long as it can resurrect, it's a good thing, no matter what method is used. Klein silently put away the sacrifice twig. Why refuse an item that can resurrect? Klein thought for a moment and asked again, "Is there anything else you need me to do?" Just asking him to deliver 2 messages didn't match such a reward at all. Klein was very clear about such matters. "Yes." Ember nodded slightly and swept his palm over the table again. This time, what appeared before Klein was no longer the sacrifice twig, but a ball of ash. A ball of ash, squeezed into a strip shape, with obvious casting marks, its surface covered with a layer of sparks. It looked like a piece of burnt charcoal, taken from a recently extinguished furnace fire. Although the fire was out, the soul ember remained, and the ash remained. Ember didn't explain this time, just said calmly, "Soul ember, give it to Mr. Fool. He knows what to do." "No, I don't know." Klein's eye twitched, and he immediately felt pressured. His intuition told him that this was definitely a very important item. And indeed, in the world of Dark Soul, this was the soul ember left within the heroes who had transferring fire throughout history. It was an item that the ashless ember could not obtain, which was why they were attracted. Using it could grant the power of fire, restore health, and increase the health limit until death. In other words, its effect was actually no less than the sacrifice ring, and even stronger in some aspects. For example, if he was in a duel and was killed directly, even if he had the sacrifice ring to resurrect. Even if the opponent didn't know he could resurrect, they would definitely collect the body. After all, he still had the Yander characteristic within him. And if the opponent discovered he had resurrected, even if they didn't know why, they certainly wouldn't mind killing him again. Conversely, it would be difficult for him, having just resurrected, to react immediately. In this situation, as the saying goes, he would be pressured upon getting up. But the soul ember was different, although it couldn't bring the dead back to life if he was in a duel. If he used a soul ember when his health was low, he would instantly be resurrected with full health, and even stronger than before, which could completely catch the opponent off guard, or even allow him to counter-kill. But now that Ember had given him this item, it definitely wasn't for him to just use the soul ember directly, there must be a deeper meaning. But the problem was, Fool really didn't know what to do. Ember suddenly said, "Oh, right, there's one more thing, Dunn is looking for you. To be precise, he's looking for Sherlock Moriarty. Also, he told me that Benson and Melissa will arrive in Backland tomorrow afternoon." Klein's expression suddenly became somewhat complex. The captain and Ember had only met once, and even though they worked together in Backland, they weren't familiar with each other before. Why tell Ember about this specifically? Isn't the answer obvious? Backland suburbs, inside a luxurious villa. The assassin, clad in black blade armor, arrived silently, stealthily entering the bedroom through an open window on the 2nd floor of the villa. In the bedroom was a tall lady with long, naturally flowing chestnut hair that reached her waist. She had an excellent figure, neither fat nor thin. Her straight eyebrows extended just right, and her eyes were blue and deep, as if they condensed an ocean. She wore a lady's shirt with a lace floral bow tie, paired with a knee-length gray skirt and a pair of tall leather boots, and a soft hat with a fine black mesh veil hanging down. The Black Blade assassin knelt on one knee before her, lowering his head deeply, as if audience her king. The lady slightly turned sideways, making way, revealing the tall bookshelf behind her. And a petite doll sitting atop the bookshelf, wearing an ice-colored demoness robe, a pointed hat, and with 4 arms. Rani whispered softly, "So that's how it is, Dee is still here, and Ashmi is still here. Even if they die, their ash will still accompany the king, until eternity. The fire thief's erosion of the king has weakened, but it still requires time." She suddenly stopped murmuring, her eyes slightly lowered, looking at the tall lady standing beside her, and instructed. "Bernadette, get ready, it's time for us to leave. George III is dead, the conspiracy that troubled the king has vanished into thin air, and they no longer need to stay here." Bernadette remained silent, her eyes slightly lowered, and she asked softly, "Where are we going?" The petite doll's gaze looked out the window, and she said calmly, "Go out to sea, to find the abyss." Backland, North District, St. Samuel Cathedral. In the Grand Prayer Hall, a lady wearing a simple linen robe sat quietly on the first row of benches on the right side of the aisle, her gaze devoutly fixed on the altar ahead. There were no statues worshipped there, only a massive dark sacred emblem. Its base was deep black, adorned with brilliance, surrounding the scarlet moon, which symbolized the goddess. On the wall behind the sacred emblem, hole after hole was opened. The moonlight from outside shone in, condensing into pure, miniature points of light. They connected with the surrounding environment, which was almost like night, transforming into the sublime cosmos. Under the shroud of night, the lady slightly lowered her head, her lips moving as if whispering softly. "George III is dead, the murderer is shrouded in mist, and even the power of night cannot see clearly. The timing of the dark star's appearance was just right, but it seems to be just a coincidence, perhaps influenced by the spectator. Only one angel of the royal family appeared, the other did not show up, suspected of having other conspiracies. The only thing certain is that benefactor was not involved, George III's death is unrelated to him." Ariana reported everything that had happened recently in detail, and remained quietly seated on the bench afterward. But for some reason, there seemed to be a hint of deep worry in her eyes. Because the goddess had not responded to her prayers for a long time. Archbishop St. Anthony quickly entered the Grand Prayer Hall, came all the way to Ariana's side, and said in a deep voice, "Your Highness Ariana, Drink Augustus has already left Backland. Georgina Augustus and Grave Augustus are also missing. All matters of the kingdom have been left to the new king alone to decide, which is very unusual." Archbishop St. Anthony's expression was quite serious. Although the royal family sometimes compromised with the nobles, the ascension of a new king was a crucial moment when the royal family must firmly hold power. In such a situation, it would not be excessive for angels to intervene. However, the royal family not only failed to do so, but instead transferred all of their several demigods, who are now missing. This meant that the royal family had completely handed over the task of guiding George IV to the nobles. And one must know that the interests of the nobles and the royal family are often inconsistent, and once George IV transfers too much power to the nobles under their guidance, it will not be easy to reclaim those powers. This abnormal phenomenon made it very difficult for Archbishop St. Anthony not to suspect whether the royal family had some conspiracy. Ariana's eyes regained their calmness, and she said softly, "They are busy destroying evidence, for now, don't worry about it." Destroying evidence. Archbishop St. Anthony was startled for a moment, but then quickly realized that there must be some secret within that he didn't know. He didn't know, and the archbishops of the other 2 great churches didn't know either. But the royal family knew, the angels and demigods of the royal family knew, and Her Highness Ariana also knew, which meant the goddess might also know. The royal family was eager to destroy the evidence, which meant this evidence was extremely detrimental to the royal family. Once the 3 great churches seized upon it, the royal family would only pay a greater price. So they were willing to cede power to the nobles, and at all costs, cover up the things they had done as quickly as possible. And this matter must involve a game between angels, or even gods. As for why there was no need to investigate, the reason was also simple. While uncovering the evidence they wanted to conceal would indeed make the royal family pay a huge price, it wouldn't directly cause the ruined kingdom to change dynasties. The existence of the royal family was beneficial to the stability of the ruined kingdom and also beneficial to the church's spread of faith. If the churches truly wanted to completely overthrow the royal family, they wouldn't need this evidence. As long as the three great churches reached an agreement, whether there was evidence or not was fundamentally unimportant. And while the current royal family might have a conspiracy, it hadn't reached the point where the three great churches would join forces to eliminate it. Therefore, there was no need to openly fall out with them. Actually finding the evidence would make it difficult to resolve the situation. Because by then, the royal family might truly cease to exist, and the three great churches wouldn't immediately find other better candidates to replace the Augustus family, which would instead cause greater chaos. Backland suburbs. In the hall with broken stone pillars, a figure quietly appeared accompanied by a faint blue light. He had a rectangular face, wore a white wig on his head, had two slightly upturned mustaches at the ends of his mouth, thick eyebrows, and large eyes, bearing some resemblance to the figures on playing cards. He wore a formal suit, draped in a cloak, with extremely long shoe tips, dressed in a manner disconnected from the current era, as if living in the previous century. And he was precisely Prince Sunia of the Ruined Kingdom, one of the few remaining demigods of the royal family, Grave Augustus. Before long, another figure also quietly appeared before him. It was a lady wearing a black evening dress. She was the Ruined Kingdom's only female Grand Duchess, Georgina Augustus. Grave was not surprised by Georgina's appearance and asked in a deep voice, "Is everything resolved?" Georgina nodded slightly and said softly, "All traces have been completely eliminated. Even if an angel personally investigates afterward, they won't find anything on us." Grave immediately breathed a sigh of relief, but afterward felt a deep sense of unwillingness. The royal family had plotted for over 1,000 years, enduring the efforts of countless generations of ancestors, and expended untold resources, all to produce a true god. Only then could they ensure the ruined royal family would truly last for eternity. After 1,000 years, they finally saw hope in their generation. But this hope came and went quickly. George III was assassinated silently under their noses, in his own palace, on his own throne. And until now, they didn't even know who did it. For this plan, they even spared no expense in resources to excavate the 9 secret mausoleums left by the Blood Emperor. And after that, they invested massive human and material resources to repair them. Just as they were about to succeed, they failed at the last moment. They had to personally destroy these 9 mausoleums they had repaired themselves and kill the slaves and commoners they had sent into the mausoleums by various means, because only then could the royal family's past actions be completely submerged in the river of history. Georgina saw Grave's complex emotions and reminded him, "Let's go first, it's not safe here. This location has long been exposed, and that person will no longer provide cover for them. It won't be long before the 3 great churches come to investigate." Grave Augustus nodded silently, took one last look at the ruins before him, and his figure quietly disappeared. East Chester County. Inside a secret mausoleum, 2 figures stood facing each other. One of them was a slightly arrogant old man with quite a few silver strands mixed in his black hair and not much beard on his face. He was precisely the former Duke of South Wales, Drink Augustus. The other had a somewhat square face, black hair and blue eyes, a high-nose bridge, thick beard, and a rather solemn expression. From their facial features, it was not difficult to see that the blood of the Augustus family also flowed within him. Or rather, he was the ancestor of the Augustus family. His appearance and image were not unfamiliar to many Loan citizens, as they were printed on the front of the 10-pound banknote. Of course, people who had never obtained a 10-pound banknote in their lives could also see his statue or portrait in places like Commemoration Day Square. He was the founder and protector of Loan, the first king, William Augustus I. Including Drink Augustus before him, he was also his descendant. And towards his ancestor, even though Drink Augustus was an angel, his heart was also filled with awe and reverence. But at this moment, the anger and suppression in the old man's heart temporarily overwhelmed that reverence, and he questioned in a deep voice. "Our plan has completely failed. Why didn't you make a move until the very end?" William Augustus I remained silent and only slowly said after a long while, "I was targeted." Drink Augustus said nothing, and William Augustus I then slowly said, "And my spirituality and divinity are warning me frantically. They tell me that if I leave this mausoleum, I will die." Drink Augustus's expression changed drastically. Not just George III and him, but even Augustus I was being targeted. But Augustus I was a Sequence 1 angel, who else could make him feel a mortal threat? Drink Augustus felt a chill all over his body and uttered a single word with difficulty. God. Chapter 177, Surprise, Surprise. The afternoon of January 2, 1350. The steam train, carrying countless hopeful people, arrived in Backland. The sky was still bright at this time, and the mist in the air had thinned considerably. The gas lamps hanging above the platform were no longer lit early. Benson, experienced, protected his sister and wallet, carried the suitcase, and followed the crowd out of the station. Suddenly, they simultaneously felt a gaze sweep over them. Following the gaze, Benson and Melissa saw a young gentleman with neat black hair and deep brown eyes. The gentleman, wearing gold-rimmed glasses, adjusted his top hat, his gaze passing over them and looking into the distance. Benson and Melissa also withdrew their gaze and looked at the column in the street garden emitting smoke, anticipating experiencing Backland's underground transportation. But just then, a gentleman of about 30, with deep gray eyes and wearing a black trench coat, walked towards them against the flow of people. Benson and Melissa also noticed him and recognized him at the same time, Dunn Smith, a police officer. However, seeing Dunn, they felt little of the joy of meeting an old acquaintance in a foreign land, only silent speechlessness. Because their most profound impression of this police officer was the time he came to their home to inform them of Klein's death. Benson was silent for a long time, then asked softly, "Officer Dunn, are you here to see us?" Dunn nodded slightly. "Yes, I have something to discuss with you. Let's talk on the way." "Okay." Benson nodded silently, neither refusing nor being able to refuse. Although their trip to Backland was not a last-minute decision, few people knew about it, especially Klein's former colleagues. After all, if it weren't for Klein, they would have had almost no interaction. And Officer Dunn being able to know the time of their arrival in Backland must have been through official channels. For example, using his authority to check their ticket purchase time and departure schedule, which is why he waited for them at the train station in advance. Benson and Melissa followed Dunn all the way to the subway station, watching him buy 3 first-class tickets and take them into a first-class carriage. Melissa sat on the soft leather seat in the first class, hesitatingly saying, "Where are we going?" Dunn Smith replied, "North District. Captain, do you have to go this far?" On a seat in the row behind the three, Klein, who looked like Joe Mingrui, sighed softly in his heart. He knew that his identity would likely not remain hidden. When Dunn first came to find him, the exposure of his identity was only a matter of time. Although that incident was disrupted by Will Osepton, the sequence one snake of fate, causing the captain to subconsciously ignore his appearance. But in their second meeting, the captain must have discovered something. At that time, he had actually guessed all this, but he had always been afraid to admit it in his heart, and afraid to acknowledge each other. He didn't know what to say, nor how to face it. So, he had instinctively chosen to avoid it all this time. As if as long as he didn't think about the problem wouldn't exist. But now the captain had thrown the problem directly onto the table, and he couldn't refuse to engage. The captain must have discovered his identity long ago. The reason he had remained inactive before was because Sherlock Moriarty had always been within his sight, allowing them to maintain a tacit understanding. But facing the disappearance of Sherlock Moriarty, this time, the captain was probably anxious. That's why he deliberately notified Ember, informing him that Benson and Melissa were coming to Backland. This wasn't said to Ember, whom he had only met once, but an attempt to reveal this news to him through Ember. As for how the captain knew the relationship between Sherlock Moriarty and Ember, the answer is not difficult to guess. As long as one carefully investigates Sherlock detective's life trajectory, they will find that he frequently goes to the same coffee shop to drink coffee. And if they investigate further, they will find that Ember also comes to drink coffee there. This is not difficult for Nighthawks with the ability to enter dreams. To even confirm the accuracy of the information, the captain would specifically ask someone to perform a divination. If that didn't work, he could also ask the mirror from the steam church. And even taking a step back, there was still the common link of Dr. Allen between them, making it difficult not to be connected. Of course, this was essentially still a test. Klein could actually choose not to engage, to pretend he never knew any of this, and continue to avoid reality. But he hesitated for a long time, and finally decided to meet. North District, Street. Samuel subway station. As soon as the subway stopped, Benson and Melissa followed Dunn out of the station. But as they exited, they found a waiting horse-drawn carriage by the roadside. Standing by the carriage was a young man with black hair and green eyes, and an outstanding appearance. He wore the same style of trench coat as Officer Dunn, with a somewhat poetic temperament. Benson also recognized him. This was also Klein's former colleague, Leonard Mitchell. They had attended Klein's funeral together. Clatter. The carriage wheels rolled forward continuously, carrying the 4 people inside along the clean and tidy streets. Melissa lifted the carriage window, looking out at the scenery with some nervousness and curiosity. By the roadside were exquisite houses, like small villas, which looked expensive at a glance. Perhaps because it was winter, or perhaps because most people had private carriages, there weren't many pedestrians on the road. Only occasionally could one see figures flashing past on the street, more often were other carriages passing by. Finally, the carriage stopped at a section of the road. The Benson siblings got out of the carriage. Melissa subconsciously raised her head, where there was a towering building. That was Backland's most famous landmark, the towering Gothic clock tower, with the Clock of Order hanging on it. This is the North District, the largest district closest to Empress Borough, and very close to the location of the Clock of Order, allowing a clear view of the entire clock tower. Benson quickly withdrew his gaze and looked at the street sign at the corner, which read, Pin Street. Dunn walked directly towards a terraced house by the roadside with the house number, 6. Before his hand could even touch the doorknob, the door was opened from the inside. The person who opened the door was an old man with white hair wearing a classical black robe. He was smiling and waving to the people outside the door. Come in quickly, I've lit the fireplace, it's warmer inside. Dunn and Leonard stood at the doorway without entering, instead casting their gaze towards the Benson siblings. After a slight hesitation, Benson led Melissa into the house. In the corner, the fireplace blazed, emitting light and heat, completely different from the cold and damp outdoors. A lady was also sitting on the sofa. She was wearing a hooded black robe, with blue eyeshadow and blush applied, and a silver chain with a white crystal pendant was wrapped around her exposed wrist. Her overall attire suggested a profession like witch, seer, or spirit medium. Benson asked with some hesitation, Officer Dunn, is this your home? No. Before Dunn could speak, the lady on the sofa said, he and I live next door at number 5. It's not my home either. Leonard, with a poetic temperament, smiled, Old Neil and I also live next door, but at number 7. Then, Dunn said softly, this is where you will live. Benson immediately understood, and gave a wry smile. Officer Dunn, you don't have to do this. We all know that Klein's death has nothing to do with you. Dunn chose to remain silent, but Leonard said very seriously, this is indeed related to Klein, but not just because of Klein. Seeing that he had attracted the attention of the Benson siblings, Leonard continued, explaining, Klein once successfully foiled a terrorist organization's plot. Although we have arrested most of the members of this organization, the mastermind has never been apprehended, and he is very likely to retaliate against Klein's family. And the police also have a targeted witness protection program in this regard. This is for your safety, and also to maintain the police's reputation. Benson remained silent, tacitly accepting this explanation. Melissa asked with some hesitation. Then, the rent. Leonard wanted to say it was free, but Old Neil interrupted him, saying with a smile. The first 3 years are free. This is, after all, somewhat mandatory. If we were to ask you for money again, wouldn't that be robbery? However, the witness protection program for you is only valid for 3 years. If you wish to continue living here after 3 years, you will need to pay a rent of £60 per year, and that's with water and electricity calculated separately. Melissa opened her mouth and muttered softly. So expensive. The house they rented at 2 Narcissus Street in Tingen was only 12 soldi a week. Converted, that's only £31 and 4 soldi a year, and the rent here is almost double the rent of the house they rented in Tingen. Leonard was silent for a long time, not attempting to correct Old Neil. 3 years is not a long time, but it's not short either. Perhaps within these 3 years, they will have already dealt with Zhangwil, in which case Benson and the others might not necessarily have to continue living here. And if they fail to deal with Zhangwil, anything could happen in 3 years. At worst, they can find an excuse to extend the protection period after 3 years. As for the £100 rent, it's actually not high at all. Even renting a house like this in Sherwood Borough would cost at least £50 a year. And if it were in Hillston District, the annual rent would basically be above £80. This is the North District, and the rent prices will only be higher. For example, the rent for this house is 120 gold pounds per year. Dunn and the others didn't stay long. After helping the Benson siblings settle down, they left the house and returned to their respective residences. Although they were next door, it at least gave Benson and them enough space. Melissa asked in a low voice, "Are we really going to live here?" Benson sat down on the sofa and chuckled. "Let's stay, there's nothing bad about it. Backland University of Technology is in the North District, so it will be convenient for you to go to school, won't it?" Melissa hugged the cushion on the sofa tightly and mumbled softly, "I might not even get in." Backland University of Industry and Technology was a university established only 2 months ago, and everything is still in preparation. The entrance exam alone won't be until June, and the school itself hasn't even fully staffed its teachers and faculty. Even now, the position of principal is still vacant. Benson smiled nonchalantly and encouraged. You have to be confident in yourself. When Klein took the Howie University entrance exam, he also lacked confidence like you, but didn't he eventually get in with excellent grades? Klein. Melissa pursed her lips tightly and lowered her head in silence. Benson also fell silent. Even though more than 4 months had passed, it still felt like it had just happened yesterday. Ding dong. Just then, the doorbell suddenly rang inside the house. Benson was slightly startled, subconsciously thinking that Officer Dunn had forgotten something. So he got up and walked towards the entrance. Click. The door was opened, but standing outside was not Dunn Smith as he had imagined, nor anyone else he had ever seen, but a strange young man he had never met. The young man politely asked, "May I come in?" Benson asked hesitantly. "And you are?" Ember introduced himself. Ash Black, Klein's colleague. "Please come in." Benson was silent for 2 seconds, then stepped aside. He was actually a little puzzled. Klein only had 2 months between graduation and starting work, so why were so many colleagues so fond of him? Is it that easy to build deep relationships between detectives? Officer Dunn was acting out of guilt towards Klein. He had mentioned more than once that Klein had saved his life, and he felt guilty and wanted to compensate him and Melissa. Although Benson felt it wasn't necessary, he could completely understand. But what about this stranger in front of him? If they were after something, what could it be? Klein's pension. He and Melissa were just ordinary people. Thinking back and forth, only the 6,000 pounds of pension seemed worth plotting over. "Mr. Aishu, is there something you need?" Benson didn't fully close the door and asked while standing in the entrance hall. Ember said, "Actually, I was entrusted by someone to bring someone to see you." Benson frowned and said, "Who?" They didn't have many acquaintances in Backland, and not many in Tingen either. Moreover, they had just moved here, and the house was arranged by Officer Dunn. Who could find them so quickly? Klein Moretti. Benson's pupils contracted slightly, and he said in a deep voice, "Mr. Aishu, I hope you're not joking about my brother, he's already dead. Don't tell me he entrusted you to come here half a year ago." "No, just half an hour ago." Ember finished his sentence, then pointed behind Benson. "As for the person you want to see, you can look behind you." Benson cautiously turned his head, and then saw a miraculous scene. A young man wearing a semi-tall silk top hat, a double-breasted long formal coat, and gold-rimmed glasses on his nose, walked straight through the doorway in front of him. And his appearance was so familiar. Klein had a smile on his face, but didn't know how to greet them. After a long time, he hesitated and waved. "Benson, Melissa, long time no see." Chapter 178. "You're noble, you're amazing, you're right to commit insurance fraud." Klein. Melissa covered her mouth, her brown eyes filled with disbelief. Benson's body trembled slightly, but he still forced himself to calm down and questioned in a deep voice. "Who are you?" "Klein is dead." Klein touched his nose awkwardly. He didn't often make such a gesture, but not knowing how else to express himself, he could only give a wry smile and say, "I did die, but you might not believe it, I came back to life." Klein paused. Resurrection was indeed hard for ordinary people to accept. Even Klein himself found his own resurrection somewhat incredible. Although he knew it was related to the Fool, he hadn't figured out the principle yet. Although he had prepared a logical and complete explanation, Benson and Melissa might not be able to accept it. After all, this explanation was reasonable and convincing to Klein, but for Benson and Melissa, who were just ordinary people, it was beyond their understanding. But since he had decided to be honest, Klein had already prepared himself mentally. Klein took a deep breath and said, "Actually, I believe you." "Ah, what?" Hearing his sister's voice, Klein was momentarily stunned, not reacting. "I believe you." Melissa had stood up at some point and walked over to Klein's side, repeating in a quiet but unusually firm voice, "Klein, welcome home." Melissa took a step forward and hugged Klein tightly with a smile. Klein's body stiffened for a moment, his hands instinctively lifting but hovering in the air. He saw the tears welling up in the girl's eyes. They were tears of joy, but underneath the shimmering light, her eyes also held a hint of anxiety and unease, as if fearing that this was all just an illusion. "Yes, I'm back." Klein gently hugged the girl back, feeling her body tremble slightly, and said softly, "And, I'm sorry, I'm late." Klein gently patted his sister's back, his gaze shifting to Benson with some hesitation. Benson was silent for a moment, then slowly said, "I think we need to have a good talk. You need to explain clearly." Klein immediately breathed a sigh of relief and said without hesitation, "Of course, I will explain everything. At 7 Pinst Street, in a reception room on the 2nd floor." Daily Simone sat on the sofa in the living room, her eyes, as clear as emeralds, fixed on Dunn Smith, who was standing by the window. Old Neil removed the lid of the silver-rimmed tin can, used a small metal spoon to scoop a spoonful of fragrant coffee powder into each of the 4 cups, then poured in hot water and stirred skillfully. "Captain." Leonard picked up 2 cups of coffee and walked over to Dunn by the window, handing one to him. Dunn took the coffee, but his gaze remained fixed on the window outside. Old Neil brought the other 2 cups of coffee to the sofa, handed one to Daly, then shook his head and said, "Actually, I still don't quite agree with your approach. It might not be a good thing for Benson and them to have too much contact with us. Perhaps letting them live ordinary lives is the best choice." Leonard took a sip of coffee and said calmly, "Are ordinary people necessarily safe? Ordinary people are only more dangerous. During the Backland Great Smog incident a week ago, if an angel hadn't happened to pass by and lend a hand, at least hundreds of thousands of people would have died. This was still with the Storm Church Archbishop dispelling the smog. Otherwise, the smog might have spread throughout Backland, with unimaginable consequences. Beyonders at least have the ability to protect themselves, while ordinary people would fall like harvested wheat." Old Neil fell silent, sighing softly after a long time. What Leonard said was actually not wrong, regardless of whether having too much contact with them was good or bad. But at the very least, living in the North District was indeed safer than living elsewhere. Of course, the Empress Borough was an exception, but given the circumstances of Benson and his sister, they couldn't live in the Empress Borough either. Dunn stood by the window, took a sip of coffee, and offered no opinion on their debate. His gaze was still fixed on the street below, on the entrance of Sixpence Street. It wasn't until a slightly familiar figure appeared before his eyes that Dunn's gaze sharpened. Dunn recognized him. It was Ash Black. "In short, that's how it is." Klein's throat felt dry. He took the cup of black tea his sister handed him and drank it in one gulp. From the moment he accidentally got involved with Beyonders because of the Antigonus family notebook, then gained Dunn's appreciation through his investigation, leading him by chance to become a Beyonder. Subsequently, in a later operation, he met Ash Black, and the two hit it off at first sight. At the same time, he also coincidentally discovered that his university tutor, Mr. Azik, was also a Beyonder, and had lived for at least 1,000 years. During this process, he used his identity as a Nighthawk to help Mr. Azik solve some problems, thereby successfully gaining Mr. Azuk's friendship. And the reason he was able to come back to life was entirely due to Mr. Azuk's efforts. Of course, while telling these stories, Klein also omitted some key information. For example, the Antigonus family notebook was only briefly mentioned, without its specific name, just referred to as an item. As for how he was resurrected, he only said it was Mr. Azuk's Beyonder ability. After listening to Klein's narration, Benson lowered his head with a deep gaze, lost in thought. Klein smiled wryly. "I know this sounds a bit unbelievable, and it's normal for you not to believe it. I believe you." "Huh, I believe you." In Klein's somewhat surprised expression, Benson repeated, then suddenly asked, "You just passed directly through the door, is that your Beyonder ability?" Klein shook his head and explained. "No, the ability to open doors belongs to a mystical item. I am a Beyonder of the Seer pathway. As for my abilities..." Klein paused, then suddenly snapped his fingers. Snap! A bright flame suddenly flew out of the burning fireplace and hovered in front of them. Klein took a note from his clothes, lit it with the hovering flame, and placed it on the table to burn to ash. And the flame that had been hovering in front of them gradually dissipated. "That's how it is." Melissa looked at the note that had burned to black ash and suddenly asked in a low voice. "Why?" Klein was taken aback. "Why what?" Melissa looked directly into Klein's eyes and pressed. "Why did you only tell us now?" Klein opened his mouth, then smiled wryly. "I've actually met you before." Benson frowned. "When?" "Probably the day after I was buried." Klein's expression was slightly odd, and he said somewhat awkwardly, "When you went to the circus." Benson and Melissa exchanged glances, their eyes showing a moment of confusion, but they quickly remembered something and said in unison. "That clown." "Yes." Klein nodded silently and explained, "The sequence 8 of the Seer pathway is clown, which was my sequence before I died." Benson frowned and asked, "Since you came to see us, why didn't you reveal yourself? Were you worried we would tell others?" Klein shook his head and said, "I was afraid of scaring you. Coming back to life isn't that easy for people to accept. And..." Klein was silent for a long time, then whispered, "I didn't want to involve you." He originally didn't plan to reveal himself to Benson and them, as that would only put them in danger. Only by staying away from them, the farther the better, could their safety be guaranteed. But the facts proved that this idea was wrong. Even if he had no contact with Benson and them at all, danger would not stay away. Just like the Backland Great Smog incident, it was too easy for a demigod of the witch cult to kill people on a large scale indiscriminately. Although an angel resolved the crisis this time, it was impossible for an angel to always appear just in time, like in a fairy tale, and save everyone. In the end, he was just avoiding the troubles that might arise from revealing himself, the dangers that might be brought to Benson and them. It was as if as long as he did nothing, Benson and they would never be in danger. Although this idea was wrong, revealing himself would indeed inevitably bring danger to Benson and them, such as in Zangwill and 008. Both Klein Moretti and Sherlock Moriarty were undoubtedly on Ince Zangwill's blacklist. Ince Zangwill wished he could personally gouge out the heart of the former, and for the latter, he even directly summoned a batch of meteorites to smash him to death. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say he hated him to the bone. This meant that as long as he appeared, he would definitely be especially watched by Ince Zangwill. And his meeting with Benson and them might also lead Ince Zangwill to kill Benson and them. A large part of the reason why Klein decided to meet Benson and them was also because Ince Zangwill had already left Backland, being pursued by Mr. Azik, the demigods of the three great churches, and an unfamiliar angel. He wouldn't dare to stay in Backland even with 008 in hand. As for other dangers related to Beyonders, since Klein dared to meet them, he had naturally thought of a solution, which was to let Benson and them possess the strength of Beyonders, while also keeping them away from the Beyonder world. In short, it was to live an ordinary life with the strength of a Beyonder. The strength of a Beyonder could give Benson and them the ability to protect themselves, and an ordinary life could minimize the possibility of being involved in the dangers of the Beyonder world. Moreover, there was the Beyonder characteristic convergence law. Even if they did nothing, becoming a Beyonder itself would inevitably bring danger. Even though the Beyonder characteristic convergence law also followed the principle of, the greater the mass, the greater the gravity. That is, the higher the sequence, the higher the possibility of encountering danger due to the Beyonder characteristic convergence law. Conversely, the lower the sequence, the lower the possibility of encountering danger due to the Beyonder characteristic convergence law, and the danger level is also much lower. But even with this slight danger, Klein hoped to avoid it. He hoped that while avoiding all potential dangers as much as possible, he could let Benson and them have the ability to protect themselves. Furthermore, he had already thought of a strategy to deal with this. He turned to look at Ember, who had been watching from the side, and nodded slightly. Ember understood and suddenly asked, "Do you mind keeping a few dogs?" Melissa blinked. "Dogs?" Benson asked in confusion. "I don't object, but why do you ask?" Ember took out a bell and an urn, and quickly explained to Benson why. Jingle. Amidst the crisp sound of the bell, 3 white mists rose. And soon, these 3 white mists condensed into 3 giant wolves nearly as tall as a person. Benson and Melissa were startled by the sudden appearance of the giant wolves, and even Klein's eye twitched. "You call these dogs?" Ember pondered for 2 seconds, then nodded slightly. "Yes, huskies look like this." Benson said in disbelief. "These are clearly wolves, right? They look similar." Klein was speechless. "What about the size? Have you ever seen a husky this big?" These 3 giant wolves were as tall as a person. Let alone dogs, even ordinary wolves don't grow this big. Okay. Simple. Ember raised an eyebrow slightly, and the lone wolves immediately understood. Under the power of Furnace of Myriad Phases, they quickly transformed from their original soul state into solid forms, and even their size was reduced significantly. At first glance, they really looked like 3 black and white huskies. Benson couldn't help but ask, "Klein, what exactly is going on?" Klein sighed and looked at Benson, saying, "In short, these 3 huskies, I invited them to protect you. Becoming a Beyonder would inevitably lead to danger, so he wouldn't let them become Beyonders. As for how to possess the strength of a Beyonder without becoming one, the ashes in Ember's hand were the best choice. This was an ability different from the Beyonder system, which didn't need to follow the Beyonder characteristic convergence law and wouldn't bring additional danger. If there had to be a danger, the only danger was Klein himself. This was his private request, and he had paid a high price for it, which made his already meager wallet even more stretched. "Klein." Benson was silent for a moment, then suddenly asked, "If we want to become Beyonders, is there a way?" Klein also fell silent, then said softly, "If you want to, you can at any time." From a personal perspective, he didn't want Benson and them to become Beyonders. Those 3 huskies were far more powerful than mid-sequence Beyonders. In comparison, the power gained by Benson and them becoming Beyonders was insignificant, and it would instead bring them danger due to the Beyonder characteristic convergence law. But if it was their wish, Klein wouldn't stop them. Melissa asked in a low voice, "Are there any disadvantages to becoming a Beyonder?" "Disadvantages?" Klein's expression became somewhat strange. If you become an official Beander, you will inevitably be involved in danger. And if you are a private Beander, the biggest danger is probably. Klein's expression became extremely serious, and Benson and Melissa also subconsciously held their breath. Klein said in a deep voice, "The biggest danger is your wallets. Even becoming a Sequence 9 Beander costs £200. And in this regard, I can't help you for the time being." As Klein spoke, his face sank. Not only could he not help Benson and them, but he was also in a lot of debt, to Ember, to Justice. Melissa said softly with some heartache, £200. Your pension is only £6,000. As soon as the words fell, the expressions of the three siblings suddenly became a little subtle. Chapter 179, Hot Potato. Although brief, it brought a sense of comfort to Klein, who had been lonely for a long time. That long-lost warm life even made him want to stay there, feeling that being with his family was more important than anything. But in the end, his rationality overcame this naive idea. This world is far from as safe as it appears, even if he stays by Benson's side. But what could he do? Could he truly protect them? A Sequence 6 Faceless is strong, and he even had a record of ambushing a Sequence 5. But in front of truly high Sequence Beyonders, in front of those saints and angels, he was nothing at all. What's more, he had a threat close at hand, in Zhangwilin, 008. Without resolving this threat, he would always be in danger. If he stayed by Benson's side, he would only drag them into danger as well. Furthermore, there was the mysterious gray fog. Although he didn't know the essence of the Fool, under the influence of the law of Beander characteristics convergence, the Fool would sooner or later bring him great trouble. Unless the Fool, like Ember, didn't belong to this world and didn't need to follow the influence of the law of Beander characteristics convergence, but this possibility was small. For example, Amon's last invasion might have been under the influence of the law of Beander characteristics convergence. Otherwise, there was no reason for the other party to be able to reach into the Fool so accurately, as if he had known about this place all along. What's more, the Fool was also related to his transmigration. Deep within that staircase of light, there seemed to be a secret that could let him go home. As a Sequence 6, he could ascend to the 4th floor, so perhaps a Sequence 5 could reach the top directly and see what was at the end of the staircase. The night was so peaceful, the red moon was so dreamy. Klein walked alone, his thoughts like a wild horse, spreading boundlessly. Sometimes he considered his revenge plan, sometimes he recalled Captain's unreliable memories, recalled old Neil's hidden sadness beneath his humor, recalled his poet classmate who clearly had no talent but insisted on pretending to be a poet, Benson's curly-haired baboon, Melissa's stinginess. Unconsciously, Klein walked into the nearest street like a wandering soul, turning through one fork in the road after another. By the time he completely broke free from that state and fully grasped his attention, 2 hours had already passed. He returned to the rented safe house in Zhou Mingrui's appearance, stood by the window, gazing at the huge red moon in the sky, and suddenly gave a self-mocking smile. Klein, oh Klein, you really are quite selfish. You already have Benson and Melissa, yet you're constantly thinking about going home. If one day you really find the way home, what about Benson and Melissa? Are they just going to be ruthlessly abandoned by you? You clearly know this path is incredibly dangerous, you clearly know you could die at any time, yet you still chose to meet Benson and them. Why? Why couldn't you just watch from afar like before? What can meeting them bring? What is there besides danger and despair? Do you want them to receive the news of Klein's death again? Or do you want them, who have just managed to escape their grief, to once again sink into gloom? Klein's expression became increasingly mocking, and increasingly bitter. I'm sorry, I'm just too lonely. In this era, in this world, he was always alone. He once hoped that Ember was a fellow traveler, but his experiences were far more bizarre than his own, and he was far more lonely. Klein couldn't understand Ember, and Ember, who had lost his memory, understood him even less. They were like two people walking alone in the darkness, wrapped in coldness and despair, instinctively seeking the comfort of fire. That's all. Hall's luxurious villa. At the request of Earl Hall, Ember had spent most of the past 2 days here, protecting Audrey and her family. As one of the first prince's most trusted nobles, Earl Hall, along with Prime Minister Aguhide, had been busy assisting George IV recently, spending most of their time at Soderic Palace. Earl Hall could only not return home, while Prime Minister Aguhide didn't even have time to go to the royal parliament and the Prime Minister's residence, only able to have other nobles and ministers send the documents requiring approval to the palace. But thankfully, after 2 consecutive days of non-stop work, they finally completed the initial statistics, and Earl Hall was finally able to escape the endless work and return home that night. Mrs. Caitlin stood at the door, looking at her husband who had just gotten off the carriage, and asked softly. You haven't been home for 2 days. Are things at the palace really that urgent? Rollhall smiled bitterly. More than just urgent. In fact, if I could, I really wouldn't want to deal with these matters. Rollhall shook his head helplessly and sighed. Forget it, let's not talk about this. At least there's good news, come down. Rollhall called out to the carriage behind him. Under the confused gazes of Mrs. Caitlin and Audrey, another person got off the carriage. It was a young man in a black trench coat, 23 or 24 years old, with bright golden hair and lake blue eyes, quite handsome. He smiled and waved at the few people. Mom, Audrey, and Hilbert, long time no see, I'm back. Alfred. Mrs. Caitlin covered her mouth, tears faintly glistening in her eyes. You're finally back. Hilbert stepped forward and gave his younger brother a hug, saying softly, we've been worried about you for so long. But it's good that you're finally back safe and sound. Sorry. Alfred had a hint of guilt in his eyes and sighed helplessly. Actually, I didn't want to either. Rollhall glanced at the two brothers hugging, coughed, and said. Let's go inside and talk. At Rollhall's command, the surrounding servants quietly withdrew, while the Earl's family went to the small reception room on the second floor. Before entering the room, Ember voluntarily said. I'll wait for you outside. No need. Rollhall shook his head and said with a smile, Ash, you're not an outsider either, come in. Let's go. Audrey winked at him, pulled him into the room, and closed the door. Alfred's eyes were somewhat playful, and he teased. Audrey, aren't you going to introduce him to me? Although he was a soldier, his ability to read people was not weak. He could tell that his family had a very good impression of this young man, otherwise they wouldn't have allowed him to be present at this time. And seeing his close contact with Audrey, their relationship was even more obvious. Ash Black. Ember smiled and extended his hand. Alfred Hall. Alfred also extended his hand and shook his, responding with a smile. Let's talk about serious matters first. Rollhall watched this scene with a smile in his eyes, but quickly sobered up and said solemnly, frankly speaking, the kingdom's current situation is not optimistic. If the Faesac Empire attacks the kingdom at this time, the kingdom absolutely cannot stop them. Hilbert was somewhat disbelieving and couldn't help but ask. How could this be? Wasn't the situation looking great before? The Navy even launched an ironclad ship in June, which was a product of the era. Even if the army is slightly inferior to the Faesac Empire, we have an advantage in the Navy. Ironclad ship. Rollhall gave a self-mocking smile and sighed. I had the same thought as you before, believing that with the epic-making ironclad ship, the kingdom could completely overwhelm the Faesac Empire in the Navy, and even retake Sunia Island would not be a problem. But now it seems the ironclad ship itself was just a facade, used to cover up the problems appearing in the kingdom. Ember suddenly asked. Financial problems. Yes. Rollhall nodded solemnly and said, 1/5 of the kingdom's financial expenditure last year is unaccounted for, and the figure we originally estimated was only 1/10. Moreover, this is not the first time this has happened, it has occurred frequently within the past 10 years. The accumulated deficit over these 10 years has reached a point where the financial deficit is too large for us to bear. Hilbert held it in for a long time before finally asking, why is this happening? The kingdom's finances have always been the strongest among the 4 nations. Why are there financial problems? Where did the money go? Rollhall looked at his eldest son and sighed. This question probably will never have an answer, because only the king knows the answer. Hilbert's expression changed slightly, and he immediately understood that this was referring to George III. After all, George IV had just ascended the throne and had very limited information, perhaps even less than him. But the question is, what did the former king do that required spending so much money? And even if you're spending money, there must be a destination, right? Can't the whereabouts of this money even be investigated? What exactly is the royal family doing? So that's how it is. Audrey sighed softly in her heart, her gaze subconsciously turning towards Ember. She was one of the people who knew best what George III was doing. Although most of it was just speculation, it was certain that George III wanted to become a god. And whether it was the Beander materials needed for him to become a god or the arrangement of the ritual to become a god, both required massive financial support. And this money, naturally, came from the finances of the Loan Kingdom. If George III successfully became a god, then all these expenditures would be completely worth it. With the blessing of a deity, the Faesac Empire would definitely not dare to violate the territory of the Loan Kingdom, and might even have to return Sunia Island on their own initiative. But the problem was that George III's plan to become a god had failed, and he himself had even been killed on the throne. And all the royal family's expenses on this naturally went down the drain, but the price had to be repaid by the entire Loan Kingdom. And the consequence was that the Loan kingdom's finances worsened, even almost reaching the brink of collapse. If George III had truly become a god, even the three great churches would not easily conflict with the royal family. But since the plan has failed, the royal family is also very aware that everything they've done might be discovered by the three great churches. And once they are caught with evidence, they will inevitably face reckoning. That is to say, the royal family will definitely be eager to destroy the evidence. That's why Dad couldn't find any evidence and couldn't trace the whereabouts of the royal family's misappropriated funds. Audrey quickly sorted out the whole sequence of events in her mind and immediately understood the reason behind the matter. But even knowing the truth, she couldn't speak it out. After all, whether it was George III attempting to become a god or the royal family attempting to create a god, speaking it out would be enough to put her family in danger. Because they, who knew all these secrets, would inevitably become one of the pieces of evidence the royal family wanted to destroy. Mrs. Caitlin frowned and asked, "Can't we just ask the royal family directly? The royal family's saints must know the specifics of what the king did." "No." Earl Hall gently shook his head and sighed, "Not only can we not ask, but we also have to find a way to help the royal family solve this problem. The reason the royal family allowed His Majesty George IV to ascend the throne was precisely for this purpose. Although there were conflicts of interest between the nobles and the royal family, when facing the external enemy, the Fasak Empire, the nobles and the royal family would either prosper or suffer together. Even knowing that there were financial problems, and that the problems were caused by the royal family, the nobles still had to fill the hole. At most, they could force the royal family to contribute more effort. Otherwise, even forcing the royal family to step down would bring no benefit, only making the financial situation worse. Alfred pondered for a moment and slowly said, "I might know part of where the money went." Hilbert's gaze immediately turned to him. Alfred tapped the table and said in a deep voice, "There's something you might not know. The kingdom has lost at least 3 demigods in the past few months." 3 demigods. Even Earl Hall's expression changed slightly at this. They all knew very well what demigods meant to a country. One must know that even the archbishops of the 3 great churches were only demigods, and the kingdom suddenly lost 3 demigods. This loss could not be said to be small. Audrey subconsciously glanced at Ember again. "You killed all 3 of those demigods, right?" Ember understood Audrey's look and slightly shook his head, indicating it had nothing to do with him. "He killed 2 at most, the remaining 1 had nothing to do with him." Alfred then added, "Every demigod has their responsibilities. Once a vacancy appears, it will lead to gaps in the kingdom's defenses in certain areas. Therefore, the loss of any demigod is fatal to the kingdom. The loss of these 3 demigods also forced the kingdom to find ways to cultivate several new demigods to fill the vacancies." After a pause, he continued, "And I am one of the candidates." "Demigod?" Hilbert's eyes suddenly widened, and he said in disbelief, "Alfred, are you already a sequence 5? "Yes." Alfred nodded slightly and said apologetically, "I was recalled to Backland earlier because of this matter, due to the level of secrecy. That's why I couldn't leave, nor could I send you a message." "Then why?" Hilbert was initially a little confused, but he quickly reacted, his expression changing slightly. It was clear there was something fishy going on here. Chapter 180, Klein Goes to Sea. Previously, due to the extremely high level of secrecy, Alfred couldn't even return home, let alone leak any related secrets. The fact that he can speak now can only be because the level of secrecy has been lowered, otherwise, Alfred wouldn't have been released. As for the reason for the lowered secrecy level, it is undoubtedly due to the death of George III. Just like the missing finances, the lost demigods will also cause fundamental problems for the kingdom. And the reason why the royal family released this information to the nobles, just like the finances, is still to get the nobles to help the royal family fill this hole. Hilbert remained silent for a long time, then sighed softly. "The royal family is playing a good game. What they did, we have to pay for." Earl Hall looked deeply at Hilbert, implying, "This may not be a bad thing for us." Hilbert was stunned for a moment, but Audrey instantly understood Earl Hall's hidden meaning. Those 3 vacant demigod positions. In the past, these positions would definitely have been taken by the royal family themselves. But now that they have released the information and need the nobles to help fill the hole, it means the royal family has given up the candidates for these 3 demigod positions. In other words, these 3 demigods will come from among the nobles. Of course, how many will come from the nobles depends on the outcome of the negotiations between the nobles and the royal family, and how much concession the royal family is willing to make on this matter. Hilbert finally came to his senses and asked hesitantly, "Is the royal family willing?" In the past, even if nobles wanted to cultivate extraordinary, they had to pay protection fees to the royal family, and all potion formulas could only be purchased from the royal family. And even when purchasing potion formulas, they only went up to sequence 5. As for potion formulas above sequence 4, the royal family never provided the formulas, only the finished products. This led to most of the existing saints in the Ruined Kingdom being from the royal family, or loyal to the royal family. And now, releasing 3 vacant spots at once is undoubtedly a huge concession for the royal family. But given the royal family's consistent strict guarding against nobles, Hilbert was somewhat suspicious of the royal family's intentions. Earl Hall chuckled softly. The royal family has no choice. These 3 demigod spots can only come from the nobles. This is the price of the transaction. The price the royal family is paying is the concession on the demigod spots, and correspondingly, the nobles also need to pay a huge price to fill the hole the royal family has dug. And this hole is even so large that most nobles could go bankrupt and still not fill it, but in order to have a demigod in their family, the nobles will definitely do it willingly. Just like Earl Hall, even though he knew this was a hot potato, knew this was the royal family's sugar-coated bullet, a poison laced with honey, he had to take it, and even swallow it. After all, the opportunity only comes once. Audrey pretended to hesitate for a while and muttered softly. But, 3 spots aren't enough to go around, right? Nobles are not the royal family, they are not a single entity. Hundreds or even thousands of nobles sharing 3 spots is clearly not enough. This will inevitably lead to uneven distribution and may even trigger further infighting among the nobles. Hearing Audrey's concern, Earl Hall didn't seem worried, but instead smiled. Audrey, you should know that many people are actually not qualified for this. Any demigod spot requires at least a sequence 5 extraordinary to contend for the position. And most nobles struggle to even cultivate a sequence 7 extraordinary. Demigod is too distant and meaningless for them. So for this group of people, other compensations can be given, such as mid-sequence potion formulas. As for the nobles who are also qualified to compete for these 3 spots, they can exchange for sequence 4 potion formulas. Sequence 4 potion formulas are extremely valuable because of their rarity. But in a sense, they are not expensive, because their replication cost is extremely low. You can just use a pen to copy it down on any piece of paper. If your memory is good enough, you don't even need paper and pen, you can remember it firmly in your mind after reading it twice. The royal family only needs to provide 1 sequence 4 potion formula to satisfy the needs of most nobles. They don't need to rush to compete for those 3 spots, because as long as they have the potion formula, they can cultivate slowly themselves. This is enough to satisfy the needs of most nobles. Many people are not greedy. Mainly because they also know they are not qualified and cannot force it. Ember suddenly asked, who do these 3 spots belong to respectively? He knew very well that Earl Hall was not someone who couldn't keep his mouth shut. If this matter hadn't been decided, he wouldn't reveal any information, even to his family. But since he said it so readily, it means this matter has actually been decided, at least internally. Earl Hall smiled slightly, pointed to Alfred, and said, Alfred was originally one of the candidates, and the Hall family will definitely take 1 spot. Of the remaining 2 spots, Prime Minister Aguhide and the Duke Negan family will take 1. The last spot will be left for other nobles. Audrey was not surprised by the first 2 spots, but still asked curiously. Which nobles are qualified to compete for the last spot? Earl Hall pondered for 2 seconds and said, the number is not large, but not small either. Marquis Lotson, Earl Gross, and Earl Livet all have a chance, but their possibility of winning is not great. Earl Hall shook his head, clearly not hopeful. Hilbert asked in confusion, why doesn't Marquis Lotson have much chance? His family is clearly as ancient as the Duke Negan family. Earl Hall explained simply, because they are all believers of the goddess. As for Earl Livet, not only is he a believer of the goddess, but the Livet family already has a demigod. According to custom, even if there is another opportunity later, they must give it up. Earl Livet is not an old noble, but one who rose to prominence in the last few hundred years, similar to the Hall family. In terms of financial resources, Earl Hall can be said to be far ahead, which is why he is qualified to negotiate and offer opinions with Duke Negan, Prime Minister Aguhide, and even the king. And Earl Livet belongs to the category of ordinary nobles. In fact, in a few more generations, they are likely to decline. But it is precisely because the Livet family produced a demigod that this family has now become one of the top great nobles in the Ruined Kingdom. And this demigod is precisely the highest commander of the Central Sonia Sea Navy, Admiral Emlyn Leavitt. Thanks to this demigod, Emlyn Leavitt's brother, Austin Leavitt, is now the governor of Alavi. As Rosal the Great once said, this is a typical case of, when one person achieves Tao, even his chickens and dogs ascend to heaven. And with the influence of the Hall family, once a demigod is born, the future will definitely be more glorious than the Livet family. Hilbert asked thoughtfully. So, the remaining spot will be given to a believer of the Steam Church. Yes. Earl Hall nodded slightly. The three great churches need to maintain balance, and their believers also need to maintain balance. Since the Hall family, who believes in the goddess, and the Negan family, who believes in the Lord of Storms, each have one spot, the third spot will default to a noble who believes in the steam and machinery god. Earl Hall said with some emotion. If Alfred hadn't happened to have the strength of Sequence 5 and had been pre-selected as a candidate by the royal family, we might not have been able to secure a spot so steadily. And the reason Alfred was chosen as a candidate was largely because we didn't have the qualifications to compete. The Hall family has been inherited for hundreds of years, far from being the oldest among the nobles, and their foundation is not particularly deep. Besides Alfred, the highest sequence of extraordinary cultivated by the family is only Sequence 7. Therefore, the Hall family does not have the deep-rooted foundation and strength like other nobles. And the reason he was chosen was because, for the royal family, such nobles are the easiest to win over. Before George III's accident, the royal family had always wanted to keep the newly cultivated demigods under their control, so Alfred Hall, a young talent with a deep foundation but extraordinary talent, successfully stood out. And now, although the spots have been traded, the candidates who were already selected definitely have priority. This means that the Hall family has received the combined support of the nobles and the royal family's intentions, thereby securing a spot steadily. Hilbert raised his glass and said with a hint of envy and teasing. Then congratulations in advance, demigod Alfred. Seeing that Alfred had already obtained the ticket to Sequence 4, while he had only just become an extraordinary, it was false to say he wasn't envious. But it was only envy. Hilbert was not jealous. After all, even if he were given this ticket, he couldn't use it. Moreover, Hilbert didn't think he had no possibility of becoming Sequence 4 in the future. With the blessing of the acting method, the risk of losing control is minimized. And with the blessing of the Hall family's financial resources, the extraordinary materials and potion formulas required for his advancement are not a problem. Becoming a mid-sequence extraordinary is only a matter of time. As for high sequence, that requires some luck. After all, he is not on the arbitrator pathway, and the potion formulas in the royal family's hands are useless to him. Alfred smiled and raised his glass in return, humbly saying, "It's still early, Hilbert. It's not too late to congratulate me when I truly advance to Sequence 4. The two each took a sip of wine, put down their glasses, and smiled at each other. And Earl Hall was also in a rather good mood. Although the financial deficit still gave him a headache, he was not the only one with a financial headache, and he was not the only one who needed to make sacrifices for it. And the benefits gained from becoming a demigod were real. Even if all the nobles combined couldn't fill the financial hole, wasn't there still the wealthy merchants? These wealthy merchants certainly wouldn't mind making some insignificant contributions to the kingdom. Alfred gently swirled his glass and suddenly asked curiously, "Ash, what pathway extraordinary are you? And what sequence?" He had heard about Ember from his father, knowing that he was a night watcher of the Church of the Night, and his status was not low. Ember thought for a moment and answered seriously. "Apprentice pathway, sequence 6 feet recorder." Audrey silently lowered her head and muttered softly in her heart. "Can a sequence 6 break into the palace and kill George III, a sequence 1 angel? Do you even believe that yourself when you say it?" Alfred recalled for a moment and said softly with emotion. "Apprentice pathway. That's a very good ability. Honestly, I'm starting to regret choosing the arbitrator pathway back then." Audrey suddenly stood up, blinked, and said, "Hilbert, don't you and Dad still have things to talk about? Ash and I will leave for a bit." Alfred, who was interrupted, didn't react for a moment, but Hilbert showed a slightly teasing smile. Seeing his mother's ant-like smile, Alfred finally reacted, the corners of his mouth slightly curved upwards, and he watched Audrey pull Ember away. "It's good to be young." As he was lamenting, Earl Hall suddenly said, "Alfred, now that you're back, you're bound to stay in Backland for a long time. You know the daughter of Marquis Lotson's family, find an opportunity to meet her." Alfred's expression stiffened, and he said with a bitter face, "Father, I'm still young. You should be more concerned about Hilbert." Hilbert, who had been secretly enjoying himself, immediately stopped smiling and coughed dryly. "Father, you know me. My career is the most important thing right now," Mrs. Caitlin said without hesitation. "Love won't delay your career. Your mother is right." Earl Hall nodded slightly, agreeing with his wife's words. Then his gaze turned to his two sons, his calm voice carrying an unquestionable tone, and he said directly, "The new year has just passed. While they haven't returned to their fiefs with their parents yet, you two should spend these few days getting to know them well. If you like them, bring them back to meet us directly." As older brothers, you can't let Audrey get married before you, can you? It's decided. Amidst the bitter expressions of the two brothers, Earl Hall issued the ultimatum. Meanwhile, beside them, the large golden retriever Susie was squatting on the ground, wagging her tail and watching the family drama curiously. At the same time, in the adjacent room, Audrey closed the door behind her and said softly, "Ember, could the royal family have some conspiracy?" Ember thought for 2 seconds, shook his head, and said, "It's unlikely. The royal family doesn't have the energy to do these things now. Throwing out these baits is both giving the nobles some benefits, letting them actively help cover up some things, and also diverting the attention of the three great churches, making it easier for them to carry out some secret actions. But precisely because of this, it's unlikely that the royal family will play any more tricks with these 3 demigod spots. Although the royal family is bad, they are not stupid. With the 3 great churches watching, any more small moves would truly make it impossible to end the situation. Since the royal family has decided to pay some price to cover up their actions, a smooth transition is what they hope to see. The best scenario is for the nobles to successfully produce 3 demigods, and this matter is then put to rest and never mentioned again." Audrey pursed her lips and nodded. She could understand it, but the impression the royal family left on her was too crazy, and this matter also involved Alfred. Hopefully, everything goes smoothly. Chapter 181, The Tarot Club. Monday, January 3, 1350. Outside the window, the sky was overcast, but there was none of the familiar fog for Klein. Waves rolled in, dispersing all the haze, allowing the high-altitude clouds to unfurl and arrange themselves into various shapes, reflecting the golden-red sunlight. This was Pritz Harbor, the largest and busiest port in the ruined kingdom. Klein, dressed in a light-colored vest and white shirt, stood by the window, gazing outside for a while until his pocket watch urged him. Only then did he return to the mahogany desk. By the warm fireplace, he picked up a deep black, round-bellied fountain pen and unfolded a letter, slowly writing to Mr. Azik. On the desk lay a light yellow identification document, a necessary item for purchasing ocean liner tickets through regular channels. For this, he had specifically sought out Sharon and obtained a new identity through her network. This identity belonged to a bounty hunter, a lunatic who wanted to venture out to sea in pursuit of wealth. According to Klein's instructions, his name was Gehrman Sparrow. After finishing the letter, Klein immediately drew the curtains, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and entered the Fool. There was still some time before the Tarot Club gathering, so Klein quickly took out Creeping Hunger and attempted to release the faceless it had imprisoned. This was both to fulfill the promise he had made to these innocent imprisoned souls and to obtain some information, such as about mermaids. But unfortunately, the answer given by the faceless was no different from the information he had obtained from other sources. Aside from those raised by the Church of the Night Goddess, one had to sail at least a week from the Gargaz archipelago into the depths of the Sonia Sea. This unlucky, faceless, had ventured out to sea precisely to pursue a mermaid, but had unfortunately died at the hands of Vice Admiral Hurricane Keelingos. Church of the Night, Klein said. Klein tapped the table lightly with his fingers and, after a long time, still gave up on this tempting option. While finding the Church of the Night would save him the trouble of making a special trip out to sea, and with Ember acting as an intermediary, the Church of the Night should not refuse. However, firstly, he did not want to owe Ember another favor, and secondly, there was one thing Klein had never understood. What role did the Church of the Night play in the Black Emperor incident? On the other hand, judging from the attitude Ember had shown, he himself was not entirely trusting of the Church of the Night. And Klein himself had personally experienced the Fool being invaded by the goddess, which had also caused Klein to remain wary of the Church of the Night. Serenity Chapel was the headquarters of the Church of the Night. Would he, the leader of a cult, not be walking into a trap by going there? Although he had to find the mermaids overseas himself, at least he had a relatively precise target and location, so it might not be too difficult. The only problem was that he, the Fool, seemed to have been exposed to many existences. Who knew if they would suddenly come knocking? Let's take it one step at a time. Klein's eye twitched slightly, and he sighed, taking out his pocket watch and pressing it open for a look. Seeing that it was almost time, he first sent a message to Little Sun, who was in the land abandoned by God and couldn't accurately tell time, informing him that it was time for the gathering. However, just then, his gaze noticed a crimson star that was constantly contracting and expanding. The amplitude was not large, but it was persistent. Klein hesitated for a moment, feeling a bit uncertain. As a nascent god's, his existence was actually quite hidden. The initial members, Justice, Hanged Man, and the Sun, were all pulled into the Fool by chance. Only Ember was someone he actively contacted. The remaining the Judgment and Miss Magician were introduced by Ember, which led to his honorific name only spreading within a small range. And Klein himself also strived to keep a low profile, not wanting this cult to be exposed to the eyes of the three great churches. Therefore, he had never actively asked the members of the Tarot Club to spread faith for him. However, when Little Sun had interactions with members of the exploration team contaminated by the true creator, he held a sacrificial ritual and chanted the Fool's honorific name, causing this honorific name to be exposed to Aemon and the true creator. Up to this point, everything was still normal, and the spread was still not widespread. However, for some unknown reason, the madmen of the Aurora Order actually used the Fool's honorific name as a clue to extensively search for the Fool's whereabouts, causing this honorific name to no longer be a secret in Backland's hidden circles. Almost everyone knew it, and the extraordinary of the three great churches were naturally no exception. Although most people knew not to pray to unfamiliar gods, there were some who were not afraid of death and insisted on praying to him. This caused Klein to hear prayers quite frequently recently. To avoid missing the prayers of Justice and the others, Klein had to go to the Fool every time to listen. Most of the time, the matters were trivial, which undoubtedly made Klein feel somewhat bothered. Klein sighed again, carefully unfolding his spirituality and extending it towards the deep red. As soon as the two came into contact, his mind buzzed, and he saw a blurred and distorted image. It was a teenage boy with brownish-yellow hair kneeling on the ground, wearing black tight-fitting clothing that was completely different from the popular trends in the Ruined Kingdom and also significantly different from the traditional clothing of foreign countries like the Fursak Empire and Intis Republic that Klein had seen in magazines. His surroundings were dim, the tables and chairs old, occasionally illuminated by sudden flashes of light, but Klein could not hear the roar of thunder or the sound of raindrops. In the image, the young man had his hands clasped against his forehead, his body leaning forward, and was praying continuously. His thick voice buzzed in Klein's ears. The Fool who does not belong to this era. You are the mysterious master above the gray fog. You are the king of yellow and black who holds good fortune. I am your loyal servant, I pray for your listening. By your side, there are traitors who want to harm you. Beckland North District, St. Samuel Cathedral, in a quiet room. Archbishop Anthony Stevenson, one of the 13 archbishops of the Church of the Night Goddess, the head of the Beckland Diocese, and a saint, looked at the figure that suddenly appeared before him. A smile gradually appeared on his face, as if he was not surprised by his appearance. Ember looked at the old man in front of him with a clean-shaven face, deep eyes, and a gentle smile, and asked in a calm tone. The Black Emperor is dead. Does the goddess have any new instructions? Archbishop Anthony gently shook his head. Benefactor, in fact, I have not received any divine revelations from the goddess for a long time. All divine revelations are conveyed by Her Highness Ariana on her behalf. As for the Black Emperor, that was never an instruction to Benefactor, merely a hint. If Benefactor feels lost about the direction to move forward, perhaps I can offer you a suggestion. Archbishop Anthony paused, then slowly said, if Benefactor has already chosen a path, then regardless of whether it is right or wrong, the best choice is to persevere and see what lies at the end of the road. Traitor. A famous quote subconsciously surfaced in Klein's mind. There are always scheming people who want to harm me. Klein's eye twitched slightly, finding it quite absurd, because this scene of prayer in front of him was quite familiar to Klein. Wasn't this the scene when Little Sun prayed to him back then? Both the clothes on the other party and the environment they were in proved that the other party's location was Silver City, and even the age and hair color of this young man were almost exactly the same as Little Sun's. But the question is, the crimson star representing Little Sun was not this one at all. He had just communicated with Little Sun, so it was impossible to be mistaken. But the problem was, even Little Sun's prayer was just an accident. How did this young man find him? Although Little Sun was naive, it didn't mean his intelligence was low. With his honest personality, he would definitely not reveal his honorific name casually. Even if this young man in front of him was Little Sun's twin brother, Little Sun would definitely ask for the Fool's opinion first. What's more, Little Sun didn't have a twin brother at all, and his parents had long passed away. So, the question is, where did the young man who was praying to him get the Fool's honorific name? This was not a difficult question to infer. Given that Little Sun could not have actively revealed it, only two people in the land abandoned by God knew this honorific name. One was Aemon, and the other was the true creator. The true creator had spread his honorific name widely in Backland, but no follower of the true creator had ever prayed to him. This indicated that this evil god was still quite particular. What was happening now was clearly not his doing. Then, there was only one possibility. Aemon. In other words, Aemon found someone who was incredibly similar to Little Sun in terms of hair color, hairstyle, physique, and age to pray to me. Does he think I would mistake the other party for little son and then pull him into the fool? If I really did that, then Eamon could use this young man as a springboard to invade the fool again. Klein's expression twitched slightly. Was he, the dignified the fool, really that much of a simpleton in Amon's eyes? If he couldn't even recognize little son, then he deserved to be invaded by Eamon. Klein decisively withdrew his spirituality and cut off the prayer image without hesitation. No matter what Eamon wanted to do, he absolutely could not let him succeed. As for the person branded as a traitor by Eamon, it was not difficult to guess. It was undoubtedly Ember. Of course, this baseless slander was directly ignored by Klein. Because in Klein's mind, Eamon was the biggest traitor, constantly thinking of invading the fool. And the purpose of this prayer was obvious. Eamon wanted to sow discord between him and Ember. Although Ember had been wanting to burn him for a day or two, he hadn't actually done it yet, had he? Klein felt that he was still quite open-minded. As long as Ember didn't actually try to burn him, they would still be good friends. Although Ember might not acknowledge the fool as a friend. Shaking his head, Klein cast all these thoughts aside and officially began to summon the members to start this Tarot Club meeting. The figures of the Tarot Club members appeared one after another, and a clear greeting from a young girl sounded in their ears. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. Neither Hanged Man nor Furs were surprised by this. Miss Justice's greeting, like reciting a menu, had become their routine at the Tarot Club. The first was always the host of the Tarot Club, Mr. Fool, and the second one was inevitably Lover. But unexpectedly, there was an exception this time. Audrey did not rush to greet Lover, but instead solemnly bowed to Mr. World. Good afternoon, Mr. World, thank you for your help. If it weren't for your information, we might not have been able to prevent this disaster, which would have resulted in at least hundreds of thousands of people in Backland dying unnatural deaths. Of course, thank you for your help, Mr. Fool. In fact, it also saved myself, Klein said hoarsely, manipulating Mr. World. Aside from the parties involved, everyone else in the Tarot Club was a bit confused, their minds filled with questions. Who am I? Where am I? What happened in Backland? What are they talking about? This lady, Emlyn White, who had just joined the Tarot Club, couldn't help but ask, what are you talking about? What disaster? What about dozens of thousands of people dying unnatural deaths? He had always lived in Backland, but he hadn't noticed anything major happening in Backland. The fool smiled and introduced. This is the new member, the Moon. This is Miss Justice. I thought the one who chose the Moon card would be a lady. While Audrey's mood lightened as she let her thoughts wander, she politely greeted. Good afternoon, the Moon. Please ask your questions later. Now is Mr. Fool's time. She turned to the fool and added. Mr. Fool, I'm very sorry, but because the three great churches and the military are clearing out Backland, I wasn't able to get the subsequent Russell's diary. Please wait another week. Hearing their conversation, Furs was startled and quickly looked towards the head of the bronze-long table, saying, Respected Mr. Fool, I have received 3 pages of Russell's diary. Undoubtedly, Miss Magician, backed by the Abraham family, had surpassed Justice and become his most stable provider of Russell's diary. This was very good. Klein was in a very good mood and nodded slightly. Very good. Russell's diary. The Moon Emlyn felt as if he had heard something incredible again. Under his questioning gaze, Furs materialized 3 pages of the diary and handed them to Mr. Fool. The first page contained little useful information, but it allowed Klein to learn that at sequence 4 of the Hunter pathway, women would change sex to male. This was the exact opposite of the witch sequence, the difference being that one changed sex at sequence 7 and the other at sequence 4. Klein pondered, turning the diary to the second page. May 5th, that unspeakable organization once again gathered its members for a meeting. I am always shocked by the way they gather their members. This is simply a miracle, no, a divine miracle. After observing for a while, I raised some questions at this meeting. For example, the names of all sequence 0 on the blasphemy slate have sufficient status, only Red Priest seems unique and not grand enough. The old gentleman sitting next to me told me that red refers to the red of war, and priest can be understood as the sacrificer of the essence of power. Someone opposed him, believing that the priest of the red priest refers to the priest of the first creator. I leaned towards the former, so I quietly asked the old gentleman's name. I don't know the identity of every member here. To be extreme, I only know a part of them. The old gentleman smiled and replied that his name was Hermes. Happy New Year. Chapter 182. The entire process was wrong. Hermes. The Hermes who created the ancient Hermes language. Hermes, the founder of human mysticism. Klein was surprised and bewildered inside, but not overly so. The Twilight Hermit Club has existed for an incredibly long time, and many historical figures were members. For example, Rosal the Great, and also George III. The Intis Republic and Intis Empire established by the former were once extremely prosperous, with the Intis Republic continuing to this day, while the latter was secretly plotting to become a god behind the back of the true god churches. Now, adding another Hermes is surprising enough, but it's not something difficult to accept. The only thing Klein was unsure about was whether the Twilight Hermit Club had existences at the level of true god. Klein believed they didn't, otherwise the Twilight Hermit Club could have directly stepped into the public eye. And from the diary, Rosal the Great clearly thought the same way. But I don't think anyone here has reached the level of a true god, otherwise there would be no need to hide behind the scenes. Of course, they might have sequence 0 level divine artifacts, such as the uniqueness of a certain pathway. Perhaps it was this that created this real dream world connecting the east and west sides of the continent, and possessed the ability to react whenever names like the Twilight Hermit Club were mentioned. At the time, I didn't think too much about it. Besides being shocked, I asked about other things, such as why the word authority was used in the description of gods. Old Mr. Hermes gave a wonderful answer. The answer: was it on the next page of the original diary, or was it too long to bother writing down, or was there no need to record it in the diary? Klein was so frustrated he wanted to travel back in time, grab Rosal by the neck, and make him tell him Hermes' answer. Klein showed no emotional fluctuations on his face, nor did he have any unnecessary body language. He simply silently turned the diary to the next page. July 7th, Shishi Festival, but it's not. This world doesn't have this traditional festival, and the calendar is similar to Earth's Gregorian calendar, not the lunar calendar. It's a pity I had too little knowledge in this area before I transmigrated. Although savants can help me recall those blurred memories, they are powerless against things I have never come into contact with. Otherwise, I might have been able to recreate the lunar calendar in this world, or even replace the Gregorian calendar, used by various countries. Unfortunately, I can't. After reading this passage, Klein remained silent for a long time. Although seemingly unrestrained and with a very rich private life, in fact, Rosal the Great's heart was as lonely as his own. Because no matter what, for this world, they were always alone. July 8th, last night I dreamed of a person, or rather, a snake. Snake. Klein's expression shifted slightly, immediately thinking of the snake the Emperor saw in the abyss, that giant snake that devoured gods. Continuing to read, the following content indeed confirmed his guess. I am very certain that it was the giant snake I saw in the abyss. He called himself Lekad who devours gods. To be honest, I am quite unfamiliar with this name. I only know of eldritch who devours gods, but I have no impression of the name Lekad. I originally thought this snake would be the dark great serpent Kaz, or the light great serpent Framit, but Lekad is not any name I have ever heard of. Of course, thinking about it afterwards, it's not strange at all. After all, the world serpent race has a considerable number. And it's not difficult to see from Kaz and Framit that world serpents are all old schemers. Although Kaz left the deepest impression on me, the possibility of being ambushed and killed by other world serpents is not small. By the way, this is also my true thought when I saw that giant snake in my dream, and he also read all of this. He praised and was surprised by my profound knowledge, but at the same time said that he didn't know any Kaz or Framit. He wasn't a world serpent either, but an undying great serpent that coexists with trees. A symbol of ancient gods. A destroyer of the supreme will. Don't ask me why I used exclamation marks, damn it. It's burning. Isn't this more exciting than burning? Klein's mouth almost couldn't help but twitch. Emperor, your inner monologue is as rich as ever. In short, although there is suspicion of glorifying himself, the one in front of me is likely not a world serpent. After all, as he himself said, the world serpents have been eaten to extinction by him. Extinct. In every sense of the word. And when I asked about the cause and process of the matter, he only told me it was the same as this time. He was thrown down, and then ate whatever he saw. The difference is, this time he ate gods, and last time he ate world serpents. The similarity is that both times he was thrown into the abyss. Although I have no grudge with the world serpents, seeing the world serpents exterminated made me feel an inexplicable joy from the bottom of my heart. I don't know what to say, I can only say, good job. I have to say, this one's teeth are really good, eating whatever he sees. Eating world serpents and eating gods, doesn't he worry about indigestion? After all, Eldritch got indigestion from eating a pseudo-girl, and could only eat half. But this also made me realize another problem. A great serpent that can easily eat an entire race of world serpents and the gods of the abyss is at least in existence at the same, sequence 0 feet level, at least a true god. And what level is the existence that can use him as a tool and throw him into different worlds to eat buffets twice? Regardless of the level, it is definitely far above a true god. Just as I guessed, there is indeed a higher level above Sequence 0. So, the question is, what should this level be called? Sequence -1. The diary ended here, but the amount of information contained within was the largest Klein had ever encountered in history. He didn't know what Rosal the Great was thinking at the time, but from the content of the diary, Rosal the Great seemed quite excited afterwards. Regarding the fact that he was being targeted by a god, and even being given a dream by a god, Rosal the Great not only showed no unease at the time, but also vaguely conveyed a sense of, I am indeed the son of destiny, between the lines. In short, he was getting arrogant. Is Rosal the Great that brave? Who gave him the courage? Liang Jingru. Klein vaguely felt it was incredible. When Rosal entered the abyss, he was at most Sequence 5. When he wrote this diary, he was likely still at the same level, and even if he had advanced, he was at most Sequence 4. A Sequence 4 saint is enough to run rampant on the North Continent, but in front of a true god, he is not even enough to get stuck in their teeth. Especially in front of that great serpent that devours gods, the outcome would definitely be literally getting stuck in its teeth. After reading the entire diary, Klein only felt a sense of strangeness and absurdity vaguely revealed within it, as if someone was sending him a scam message. Hello, I am Qin Shi Huang. In fact, I am not dead. I have 100 tons of gold in Xi'an. I now need 2,000 yuan to unfreeze my gold in Xi'an. You can transfer it to my WeChat or Alipay. The account is my mobile number. After transferring, I will immediately bring my troops back to life tomorrow and let you command the army. The difference is, that snake really ate gods, he wasn't scamming Rosal. But precisely because of this, doesn't it seem even more terrifying? No. Klein's eyes flashed, and he suddenly realized something. That dream should have lasted for a considerable amount of time, and the information the undying great serpent Lacad revealed to Rosal the Great was definitely more than what was recorded in the diary. In other words, that great serpent provided Rosal with some definite information to gain his trust, or perhaps there was some secret transaction between them. No, it is very likely that they had already reached some kind of agreement before this, before Rosal the Great left the abyss. That's why Rosal the Great could remain calm and composed in the dream, and even write a diary to make fun of it afterwards. Then why didn't he write it down? It is very likely that he was afraid of being noticed by that snake, just like the Twilight Hermit Club. Without permission, once the name of the Twilight Hermit Club is mentioned to the outside world, they will immediately be detected. And the members of the Twilight Hermit Club who did this have all been eliminated. For that great serpent, it would probably mean being eaten. And this only made Klein even more helpless. Emperor, you only write half of your diary entries each time, which makes him very uncomfortable. You know you'll get beaten for this, right? Klein leaned back slightly, and while letting the diary disappear from his hand, he said with a smile. You can begin. He had spent enough time reading the diary, and some details could be analyzed later. Even though he was the fool, it was not good to make others wait too long. Hanged Man Alger was the first to speak. He asked quickly and directly. Miss Justice, I want to know what exactly happened in Backland during this time. What kind of reward do you need? He was at sea and did not know what was happening in Backland. He only knew that George III suddenly died of illness and George IV inherited the throne. As for other details, he knew nothing. And this was undoubtedly fatal for Alger. He had to be constantly updated on all intelligence. Audrey sat up straight, a faint smile on her face, and said. No reward is needed. Exchanging general information about our respective areas for free is the purpose of our tarot club. You should all know the cause of the incident. The matter of Prince Edisic colluding with the witch sect was exposed. He killed the law enforcement officers who came to arrest him and fled with the witches he was harboring. And the witch sect wanted to take this opportunity to create a plague in Backland and have the god they believe in, Witch Kick, descend upon Backland. This plague would have originally caused at least hundreds of thousands of deaths, but with the help of an angel, the crisis was successfully resolved, with no casualties. And on the day of the New Year's Eve party, Prince Edisic even gathered several demigods to break into the palace and kill King George III. This information is semi-public and can be found out with a little time spent inquiring. Therefore, Audrey did not hide anything and directly provided this information to the other members of the Tarot Club for free. As for the true cause and effect of this matter, that is paid content, and the opinion of the person involved must be consulted before revealing it. The Moon Emlyn White's mouth was wide open. He, who always considered himself well informed, suddenly began to doubt his life. He started to wonder if the Backland he and the other party were in was the same place. Although Miss Justice spoke lightly, anyone could realize the danger involved. The protagonists of this incident were either angels or demigods, levels that they could not normally come into contact with. The most direct proof of this was that despite such a major event happening, they were completely unaware of it. They only knew that Prince Edisic had defected, and that was because the kingdom was conducting a massive search. Even Alger, who was far out at sea, received a wanted poster for Prince Edisic, with a shockingly high bounty. But who would have thought that the inside story of this matter was so complex? Magician Furs couldn't help but ask. So, Prince Edisic successfully assassinated George III. Assassinated the king. Where is he now? Audrey explained. The royal family also had an angel take action. All the saints who invaded the palace have died, including Prince Edisic. She did not explain that George III himself was a Sequence 1 angel, because that was also paid content. Moreover, Miss Furs seemed to be unaware of the inside story. Ember apparently did not tell her the specific situation, and similarly, Miss Hugh should also be unaware. This was an easy conclusion to reach. In other words, only 3 people truly knew the truth of the matter. The Fool, Ember, and herself. While feeling proud and happy, Audrey couldn't help but feel a hint of confusion. Why her? This matter is definitely not as simple as it seems on the surface. Hanged Man Alger immediately made a judgment after hearing the information Audrey revealed. He believed that justice would not give false information, but it was definitely not the whole truth. Of course, even just partial information was already astonishing. Especially those demigods that Prince Edisic gathered. Where did he get so many helpers? It should be known that a typical secret organization only has 2 or 3 saints, and even a relatively strong one like the Aurora Order only has 5 saints. And even the true God churches do not have more than 10 saints. In other words, for Edisic to invade the palace, he must have had the full support of a secret organization. And where did Edisic get such influence to make the demigods of a secret organization willingly die for him? Even the most fanatical Aurora Order would not do something like attacking the palace with 5 saints. Even if they did attack, the true creator would definitely take action personally, or at least have an angel cover them, rather than sitting by and watching those demigods perish. Unless, this organization doesn't care about the lives of these demigods at all. A thought suddenly popped into Alger's mind, and he subconsciously looked at the lovers next to him. Chapter 183. You are more of an emperor than the emperor. For any faction, extraordinary of the saint level are indispensable. No faction would casually send saint-level combatants to their deaths, especially several at once. This would be enough to severely weaken a major power, or even cause it to be completely annihilated by other secret organizations. Let alone Prince Edisic, even George III himself might not have such capability. Unless there's a person or organization who completely disregards losses secretly supporting Edsac, with the goal of eliminating George III. And in Alger's understanding, only Lover met these expectations. He possessed a certain ability to summon deceased spirits, and even if the summoned spirit died, as long as the ashes remained, they could be summoned again. This meant that Lover was fully capable of summoning several saint-level combatants, and also had the motive to help Prince Edisic eliminate George III. Of course, these were just speculations, and Alger currently had no evidence to prove any of it. Hanged Man's eyes flickered, and he slowly spoke. Mr. Lover, have you obtained the Ocean Singer potion formula? Of course. Ember nodded gently. Hanged Man's lips curled slightly upwards, clearly in a good mood, and he quickly said. Then, as agreed before, £5,000. I only have £3,000 on hand, Miss Justice, I hope to borrow £2,000 from you. Audrey smiled slightly. No problem, Mr. Hanged Man, this was agreed upon last week. Before coming of age, her allowance was strictly limited to £1,000 per month, which made her finances tight. Just paying Ember £1,000 in rent each month was enough to exhaust her monthly pocket money. Fortunately, she still had some savings, and Earl Hall, upon realizing she had become an extraordinary, directly increased her allowance from £1,000 to £2,000 per month. Even if she occasionally needed money urgently, she could borrow from Gleeland Viscount for temporary use. It was based on these various reasons that Audrey had enough capital to lend to other members of the Tarot Club, and it was interest-free. At the same time, after she came of age at the New Year's ball, she gained control over her own property worth £400,000, though she had to employ several accountants and managers sent by her father. The gifts she received, including jewelry, horses, hounds, and famous paintings, totaled over £20,000, mostly from her mother, her 2 older brothers, and other members of the Hall family. As for cash, it wasn't much, just £5,000. Her contribution during the Backland Great Smog event, due to her request for concealment, did not receive any rewards. This was all converted into Earl Hall's political resources. Because of this, the great noble and banker stated that any future expenses his little angel incurred in the field of mysticism could be reported. Therefore, Audrey now had no need to worry about money at all. With all three parties confirming there were no issues, Ember directly used the paper and pen manifested by the Fool to write down the Ocean Singer potion formula and hand it to Hanged Man. For Alger, the main ingredients weren't too difficult to obtain. There were enough extraordinary creatures on that primitive island that there would always be suitable ones. The auxiliary ingredients were relatively easy to collect and didn't require too much concern. Only the ritual was the utmost priority. Consume the potion inside an Obnis's belly. Alger silently read the ritual's content, and corresponding information quickly surfaced in his mind. Obnis was an ancient sea monster that could directly swallow a sailing ship. It had a massive, twisted body, up to 3 heads, and intertwined tentacles, making it the protagonist of many legends at sea. Most of these sea monsters had been tamed by the Storm Church and had fixed activity areas, but it was unknown if they possessed intelligence close to that of humans. No wonder the Church controls Obnis instead of other sea monsters. No wonder there are so many extraordinary of the sailor pathway among pirates, but only a few can reach Sequence 5. They either inherited it directly or are subordinates of the kings of the 5 seas and the mysterious queen. So where should I look for an Obnis that doesn't belong to the Church? Alger frowned slightly, thinking about how to bypass the Storm Church to advance. Mr. World had clearly encountered the same problem. His search for mermaids was likely because mermaids were also part of the ritual. And according to the information Alger had obtained, most mermaids were strictly protected by the Church of the Night, which meant the Church of the Night should also be cultivating extraordinary of the diviner pathway. Because of this, Mr. World could only leave the near seas and travel far towards the area near the God War ruins to search for traces of mermaids. In the place where the God War ruins were located, various monsters emerged endlessly, and perhaps there would also be Obnis among them. This meant he might be able to cooperate with Mr. World. Alger didn't dwell on it for too long and quickly turned his gaze to Ember, saying sincerely, "Thank you for your help. I will sacrifice the gold pounds to Mr. Fool as soon as possible." He didn't doubt the authenticity of the potion formula, firstly because Mr. Fool vouched for it, and secondly because Mr. Lover's credibility had always been extremely high. In the entire Tarot Club, except for the initial few Sequence 9 formulas, almost all subsequent potion formulas were provided by him. What in the world is happening? Moon, Aemlin lowered his head. He felt his worldview had been greatly impacted and was starting to doubt life itself. It started with a demigod wanting to slaughter Backlund to allow the original witch to descend, but was coincidentally saved by a passing angel. Then George III was assassinated by Prince Edisic, and the father and son, showing filial piety, both perished. But up to this point, it could still be treated as background setting, and Aemlin could still force himself to be energetic. However, what followed became quite outrageous. Lover provided Hanged Man with the Ocean Singer potion formula. Although Aemlin didn't know what pathway this potion formula belonged to, judging from the price of £5,000, it was at least a Sequence 5 potion formula. This also meant that Mr. Hanged Man was a Sequence 6 extraordinary, otherwise there would be no need to seek a Sequence 5 potion formula. The problem was, Hanged Man was asking for a Sequence 5 potion formula, but he didn't even have the money to pay and had to borrow. And the one he borrowed from was that Miss Justice who greeted everyone like a broadcaster. It was clearly a huge sum of £2,000, yet she lent it out without batting an eye. And judging by the reactions of the other Tarot Club members, they were clearly already used to this. In other words, this small amount was simply not worth mentioning to Miss Justice. £2,000 wasn't impossible for Aemlin to come up with. If he sold all his beloved dolls, raising £10,000 would be easy. But that was impossible. He would never sell his beloved dolls, not even allow them to get dirty. And if he didn't sell the dolls, his savings were completely insufficient. Miss Justice was undoubtedly a rich woman, and quite generous. It was clearly not the first time she had provided loan services to other members of the Tarot Club. This made Aemlin a little tempted, hesitating whether to borrow some money from Miss Justice to buy the doll he had long desired. While Aemlin was struggling with the dilemma of should I take out a loan for my doll wife, Justice Audrey also didn't forget that a certain member of the Tarot Club was still in danger. She immediately looked towards Thiessen, Derek diagonally opposite her. Have you broken free from that cycle? Son, Derek first nodded honestly, then bowed to the seat at the head of the bronze long table. Great Mr. Fool, thank you very much for your guidance. This allowed me to find the key point of the Fate Angel on the mural with the Redemption Rose text, helping Chief break the cycle of fate. What, Fate Angel? I don't know anything. The very confused the fool Klein responded with a smile. Not bad. Derek also described his actions and the corresponding results in detail, emphasizing the fact that the little boy Jack was from Enmat Port and the specific details of the mural where the Redemption Rose was located. For example, the 8 angel kings surrounding, the Lord who creates everything, the omniscient and omnipotent God, including Time Angel Amen, and the Fate Angel shown on the mural, the Ouroboros. Unable to suppress her curiosity, she asked, Mr. Sun, what are the titles and names of the other 6 angel kings? Chief didn't say, I didn't dare to ask, the son Derek replied somewhat shamefully. I really want to know the answer. Audrey subconsciously looked towards the head of the bronze long table, gazing with eager eyes at Mr. Fool shrouded in gray fog, hoping to get the corresponding answer. She had already thought about what price she was willing to pay for it. Moon, Aemlin looked completely bewildered. He had just managed to struggle out of the impulse to take out a loan for his wife. Immediately after, he heard about Redemption Rose, Fate Angel, Breaking the Cycle, Angel King, and the Lord who creates everything, the omniscient and omnipotent God. All of this was beyond his scope of knowledge. He felt like he could understand every single word, but when put together, he had no idea what they meant. Why are you looking at me? I don't know either. Klein controlled the twitching of his mouth, but fortunately, he could shift the responsibility. The fool leaned back slightly against the chair, deliberately adopting a relaxed posture, and smiled. Miss Justice, perhaps you can get the answer from Lover. Audrey blinked and turned her gaze to Ember, as if asking, do you know? Ember pondered for 2 seconds and nodded slightly. I have some understanding. Audrey asked curiously with great interest, for example. Ember didn't conceal anything and said casually. For example, Time Angel Amen, and Visionary Adam. Among the 8 angel kings, only these 2 are the descendants of the ancient sun god. Visionary Adam. Most of the Tarot Club members, except for the still bewildered the Moon, had some understanding of this information. They were relatively familiar with Time Angel Amen, while Visionary immediately made them think of the ancient god from the past, the dragon of imagination Angerweed. And Klein went a step further. He knew that the sequence 0 of the audience pathway was Visionary. And this Visionary Adam was very likely the mastermind behind the Twilight Hermit Club. He should not yet be at the sequence 0 level, only sequence 1, but was probably only a step away from sequence 0. Furs also couldn't suppress her curiosity and asked hesitantly. What about the other 5? Ember pondered for 2 seconds and slowly said. There are 5 others. I have probably met a few of them, but I don't know their titles, only their names. What do you mean, probably met? Hanged Man's pupils contracted slightly. Could these angel kings have lived until now? That's right, Time Angel Amen is still active today, and the other angel kings wouldn't be much worse than him. It's not strange that they could live until now. But the question is, when did Ember meet them? Could these angel kings all be in Backland? That doesn't seem right. Moreover, even if they had met, why would he know their names but not their titles? For someone unfamiliar with these 8 angel kings, shouldn't the first thing they know be their titles? For figures of this level, their true names should be something of a taboo and even less known. These words completely aroused the curiosity of the Tarot Club members, and many couldn't help but want to ask questions. It wasn't until Mr. Fool lightly tapped the table with his finger that the gazes of the others were instantly drawn to him. Klein slowly warned. Do not chant their true names in the outside world, nor write them down. Audrey's heart immediately tightened. She remembered the characteristics of the Twilight Hermit Club. As soon as their organization's name was mentioned, they would be noticed. And these angel kings were probably the same. This made Audrey immediately abandon the idea of asking further questions. Knowing the names of these people was not necessarily a good thing for her. Hanged Man clearly had the same thought and lowered his head slightly without speaking. Klein glanced at the reactions of the others without showing any emotion, while silently organizing the information he had obtained in his mind. Fate Angel, Ouroboros. He should be the sequence 1 Mercury Snake of the monster pathway. And this former angel king now appearing in the True Creator's temple mural means that he is likely still following the True Creator. And this also indirectly confirms Ember's statement that the True Creator is the creator from the past. Otherwise, Ouroboros would have no reason to stay by the True Creator's side. Only if these 2 were originally the same existence could Ouroboros remain loyal all this time. That's not right either. Klein suddenly discovered a blind spot and thought hesitantly, Ouroboros is faithfully following the True Creator, but what about the other 7 angel kings? If only Ouroboros is still by the True Creator's side, doesn't that mean the other 7 angel kings have all rebelled? Klein's expression became strange, and his eye twitched instantly. This Creator is doing too poorly, right? The Emperor only had 9 out of 18 sons rebel, but you had 7 out of 8 Angel Kings rebel. You're doing even worse than the Emperor. Chapter 184, Being Rich is the Truth. The true creator's experience was regrettable, but it didn't change the fact that the relationship between the two parties wasn't harmonious, so Klein didn't intend to worry about the other party. Moon, Emlyn observed about 60% of the transactions made in the Tarot Club, and he was also eager to try. Everyone, who knows how the Blood Clan can improve their strength without relying on gifts from their elders. As soon as he finished speaking, he felt eyes looking over at him. At this moment, even across the gray fog, he could feel the gazes of the others. Most of them were curious, like the ladies who were quite curious about his existence. Audrey and Furs both had bright eyes. They had heard many rumors and stories about the Blood Clan, and most of them had some beautiful imaginations about this race that was similar to humans. Besides that, there was also surprise and doubt, like Derek. His first impression was of a vampire hidden deep in the darkness, covered in pus, and moving like the wind. Emlyn, being stared at by so many eyes, suddenly felt a little at a loss, vaguely realizing that he seemed to have asked a question he shouldn't have asked. Why are you looking at me? Can't I have a Blood Clan friend? Do I need to explain? No, what's wrong with the Blood Clan? I am Blood Clan, there's nothing to be ashamed of. We Blood Clan have a long history, a long life, and abundant accumulation. We are a noble race. As for the Tarot Club, although the others talk about saints or angels, or even angel kings. But from the content of their conversations, the highest level they have reached is Sequence 6, at most someone is about to advance to Sequence 5, which means their own strength is not particularly great, and they cannot be compared to the Blood Clan. As his thoughts flickered, changing several times, Emlyn White raised his chin and added proudly. Yes, I am a pure Blood Clan. Nobody asked him if he was. Mr. Moon seems a little guilty, so he reacted excessively. Miss Justice Audrey read Emlyn's performance. Miss Audrey felt a sense of similarity between Mr. Moon's performance and Little Sun's. Both sides are equally, well, naive and inexperienced. But Little Sun is like that because he is too young and the environment he is in is the dangerous land abandoned by God, where he hasn't been exposed to outsiders. But isn't Mr. Moon a Blood Clan? Although his voice sounds quite young, Blood Clan are generally much older than humans, right? Furs asked curiously. Mr. Moon, does your Blood Clan, like humans, divide titles such as Duke, Marquis, Earl, Viscount, and Baron to indicate different levels and statuses of powerhouses? No, you humans are imitating our Blood Clan. Emlyn immediately bristled and argued about the origin of the titles. What about the Blood Clan having titles of Duke, Marquis, Earl, Viscount, and Baron long before the Cataclysm, and how humans were still under the rule of the Giant King's court at that time and couldn't have invented titles, and so on. However, Little Sun from Silver City, which also inherited from the ancient Second Epic, immediately refuted him. The division of the Blood Clan is based on the appearance of the blasphemy slate. This view was agreed upon by most members of the Tarot Club, because even in the records of the North Continent, the birth of the extraordinary system is marked by the blasphemy slate. However, Emlyn clearly did not agree and immediately refuted the view of Silver City, which appeared out of nowhere. As a result, the two sides engaged in a fierce debate. Although Little Sun is honest, sincere, and introverted, he is inwardly a stubborn person. And Mr. Moon is obviously very proud of the history of the Blood Clan, and is equally stubborn on this matter. This is natural, after all, he himself is a Blood Clan. But precisely because neither of them would give in, if no one stopped them, Audrey had no doubt that they could argue about this issue until the end of the gathering. Just as Audrey was hesitating on how to tactfully remind them, Mr. Hanged Man suddenly spoke up, interrupting their argument. I know how the Blood Clan can improve their strength. The Blood Clan can also consume potions to advance. And I happen to have a clue about the remaining extraordinary characteristics of a Blood Clan Baron who died in a sudden conflict. You can inherit the legacy through the potion method, so that the power of the Blood Clan is not lost. What price do I have to pay? Emlyn indeed stopped arguing and asked, a little tempted. Mr. Hanged Man's eyes moved slightly, and he slowly said, about £5,000. 5,000. Emlyn exclaimed in surprise. His first reaction was to give up the transaction. With this money, he could buy several dolls he had been eyeing for a long time and even get a few new sets of clothes for all of them. Wouldn't it be better to keep this money to support his wife? What's more, the premium was too severe. It should be known that the Blood Clan are naturally extraordinary creatures, and the corresponding extraordinary system is the apothecary pathway. Underage vampires correspond to Sequence 9 Apothecary and Sequence 8 Beast Tamer, while adult Blood Clan correspond to Sequence 7 Vampire, which means that as long as they reach adulthood, they can steadily reach the level of Sequence 7. Above that are Duke, Marquis, Earl, Viscount, and Baron, and the Blood Clan Baron corresponds exactly to Sequence 6. The market price for a Sequence 6 extraordinary characteristics is usually between £3,000 and £4,000, but Mr. Hanged Man started at £5,000, which completely exceeded Emmeline's expectations. Audrey's eyes lit up, and she proactively asked, "Mr. Moon, do you need a loan?" Emmeline, who was full of hesitation and didn't know whether to refuse, was stunned for a moment and said hesitantly, "Let me think about it first." Seeing that the time was almost up, Klein controlled Mr. World to speak in a hoarse voice. "I have a Sequence 6 feet faceless, extraordinary characteristics. Mr. Hanged Man, I would like to ask your craftsman friend to make it into a magical item and sell it. You can take a 15% commission from it." Mr. Hanged Man raised an eyebrow and immediately agreed. Pleasant cooperation. There was no reason for him to refuse money for free. Audrey said with bright eyes, "Mr. World, can I reserve it?" Klein was stunned for a moment, and without hesitation, he controlled Mr. World to nod and agree. Of course. His purpose was simply to sell this extraordinary characteristics to add some thickness to his thin wallet. If someone could buy it, that would be the best. Mr. World said hoarsely, "But you might have to wait a day. I need to separate this extraordinary characteristics first." The Darkless Cross was sacrificed to the Fool by Ember in front of Audrey, and Theoside effect of this item is quite uncomfortable when worn, but it is quite useful at certain times, such as being able to split an extraordinary characteristics into several parts to sell. On the other hand, although this item belongs to the Fool, a true god-level figure obviously doesn't need this thing, so it is very reasonable for him to bestow the Darkless Cross to his benefactor. Klein considered these things before not hiding it. Audrey nodded gently, then added, "In addition, if possible, I hope to purchase the separated extraordinary characteristics as well." After a pause, she added, "In fact, one of my friends happens to have chosen the diviner pathway." Quote. Klein was stunned for a long time, thought for 2 seconds, and then slowly said, "How about £6,000 for the extraordinary characteristics from Sequence 9 to Sequence 6? From Sequence 9 to Sequence 6, the market price of 4 extraordinary characteristics is roughly between £5,500 and £7,200. Since Miss Justice is so readily buying them all, Klein simply gave a package price. Deal. As soon as Klein finished speaking, Audrey happily accepted. She knew that she could bargain for this kind of thing, but she didn't think it was necessary. For Audrey, money was not a problem. Just like Rosal the Great's famous saying, "Problems that can be solved with money are not problems." Hilbert was just worrying about collecting the main materials for the potion, but with the extraordinary characteristics, he no longer had to worry about this aspect. However, Audrey also had a little selfish motive, which was that she did not plan to give the Sequence 6 feet faceless, extraordinary characteristics to Hilbert, but was preparing to find Mr. Hanged Man's friend to make it into a magical item. Ember also suddenly spoke, "Mr. World, I have a few extraordinary characteristics that I need your help to separate." Okay. Klein agreed without hesitation, but after a moment's hesitation, he asked, "Sequence-level extraordinary characteristics? How many in total?" Ember pondered for 2 seconds, and did not hide anything, but still flipped through his backpack before speaking. "A total of 5, 1 extraordinary characteristics of a Sequence 4 feet manipulator, of the Spectator pathway, 1 extraordinary characteristics of a Sequence 4 feet arbitrator, of the Arbitrator pathway, 1 extraordinary characteristics of a Sequence 4 feet fallen Earl, of the Lawyer pathway, 1 extraordinary characteristics of a Sequence 4 feet ancient alchemist, of the Farmer pathway, and 1 extraordinary characteristics of a Sequence 3 feet silent disciple, of the Prisoner pathway." After a pause, Ember continued, "Among the separated extraordinary characteristics, the extraordinary characteristics below Sequence 7 can all be given to you as payment." Quote. The atmosphere of the Tarot Club instantly fell silent, and the scene was completely quiet. Although their conversations were about saints or angels, it was only limited to conversations. Both saints and angels are the top combat powers of the major forces in this world, existences standing at the pinnacle of extraordinary. They would not be devalued because of their conversations. And now Ember directly took out 5 Sequence 4 extraordinary characteristics, which means the fall of 5 saints. Audrey's eyes were bright, and she was the first to react, raising her hand and saying, "Can I reserve the Manipulator extraordinary characteristics?" "Yes." Ember smiled, "This was originally prepared for you." Audrey blinked, her face calm. "The judgment?" Zio hesitated for a moment and said softly, "I want to reserve the extraordinary characteristics separated from the Arbitrator pathway, is that possible?" Zio was clearly a little lacking in confidence, because she didn't have that much money. She is now a Sequence 7 interrogator, and the 2 extraordinary characteristics needed between Sequence 9 and Sequence 7 were all provided by Ember. Sequence 6 extraordinary characteristics can also be obtained from Ember, but even with a friendship price, it would still cost a full £3,500. And this amount of money, even with the help of Furs, who is backed by the Abraham family, is not a small figure. Ember pondered for 2 seconds and nodded slightly. I can hold it for you for a while. Mr. World coughed dryly and said hoarsely. Demigod-level extraordinary characteristics are not that easy to analyze, it will take a long time. Also, I have a friend who is an extraordinary of the prisoner pathway, she might need the Sequence 4 extraordinary characteristics separated from Zalent disciple. If possible, I would also like to reserve it for a while. Okay. Ember nodded gently and did not refuse Mr. World's request. And Klein also breathed a sigh of relief. This extraordinary characteristics of his was actually reserved for Sharon. After all, Miss Sharon is already a Sequence 5 Spectre, and if she wants to continue to advance, this Sequence 4 extraordinary characteristics is quite important. Moreover, Marich also needs to advance to Sequence 5 next, so the separated Sequence 5 Feet Spectre, extraordinary characteristics might also be kept. As for the payment, Klein was actually too embarrassed to ask for it proactively. After all, the Darkless Cross was given by Ember. Although it was ostensibly given to the Fool, he only received this magical item as a benefactor of Mr. Fool. But even so, Klein was too embarrassed to proactively ask for payment. However, since Ember offered to give it, Klein would not act tough and refuse. The extraordinary characteristics from Sequence 9 to Sequence 7, if sold separately, would be at least £2,000, which is a considerable income. And if all 5 are added up, that's a full £10,000, a sudden fortune, isn't it? Miss Audrey raised her hand again, excitedly saying, if possible, I hope to purchase the extraordinary characteristics below Sequence 7 directly from Mr. World. And if Mr. Lover doesn't need the Sequence 6 and Sequence 5 extraordinary characteristics, I also hope to purchase them. Klein didn't react for a moment and said in a daze. Which pathway? Audrey said very seriously. All of them. All of them. Klein opened his mouth. Although he knew Miss Justice was rich, did she really need so many extraordinary characteristics? Or rather, did she have so many friends? Audrey also saw the confusion of the crowd, so she decided to explain a little. In fact, my family is preparing to cultivate a batch of extraordinary, so the demand in this area is very large. If you have unnecessary extraordinary characteristics, magical items, or extraordinary materials, you can sell them to me. After a pause, Audrey added, of course, you can also make special purchases. As long as the premium is not too high, I should accept them. Quote. The Tarot Club fell silent again. They knew that Justice was rich, but they didn't expect her to be this rich. Mr. Hanged Man was silent for a long time and slowly said, Miss Justice, the price of extraordinary characteristics is not a small amount. How much funds have you or your family prepared for the purchase? Miss Justice Audrey thought for a moment and replied, because it is still in the initial stage, the initial investment is only about £200,000. £200,000. And only. And initial investment. Klein was numb, tears of envy almost falling. How great it would be if I had money. Chapter 185, You Lost. I didn't, I made a fortune. The main reason Miss Audrey suddenly started collecting extraordinary characteristics and extraordinary materials on a large scale was that the Hall family needed a transformation. Alfred had already secured a spot to become a demigod, which meant the Hall family would leap to become the most prominent family in the entire Ruined Kingdom. And such a family must have a corresponding foundation. However, the Hall family, with a history of only a few hundred years, clearly lacked sufficient foundation. Before this, they didn't have many extraordinaries, and they were entirely concentrated in the arbitrator and lawyer pathways, with the strongest only being Sequence 7. This was clearly insufficient for a family that was about to have a demigod. For example, Duke Negan, even with a Sequence 6 extraordinary sent by the Storm Church for protection, still had a Sequence 5 Feet secretary, protecting him personally, and this secretary was cultivated by Duke Negan's family. The Hall family lacked such a foundation, so they could only start cultivating it slowly from now on. Fortunately, although the Hall family lacked foundation, they were not short on money. As the foremost banker in the country, Earl Hall's wealth could rank among the top 3 in the entire Ruined Kingdom. Moreover, Earl Hall also had his own private bank. Even if he didn't have enough money, he could borrow from his own bank. Therefore, the Hall family's goal was very clear, to exchange money for time. They wanted to use their existing wealth to collect as many potion formulas and extraordinary materials as possible, in order to cultivate extraordinaries in large numbers. While ensuring that the pathways for extraordinaries were sufficiently diverse, they also needed to raise their sequences as much as possible. However, neither Earl Hall nor Alfred, who was about to become a demigod, had enough connections to collect enough mid-sequence potion formulas and the required extraordinary materials, which was the current concern of the Hall family. Therefore, upon learning of this situation, Audrey immediately thought of the Tarot Club. The members of the Tarot Club were strong enough and had extensive connections. Most importantly, they were short on money. Whether it was Mr. World or Mr. Hanged Man, they were extremely short on money. If they weren't short on money, they wouldn't need to borrow from her. And their connections could ensure they could collect enough potion formulas and extraordinary materials, and these things could be delivered to her through Mr. Fool. The only issue was that Audrey was worried this might displease Mr. Fool. However, what she didn't know was that this was precisely what she didn't need to worry about, because Mr. Fool was very excited right now. Nothing else, just a lack of money. Klein suppressed his emotions and controlled Mr. World to say in a hoarse voice, "Miss Justice, what are your requirements for these items? And what kind of compensation can you offer?" Audrey thought for a moment and said, "I will spend £200,000 to purchase extraordinary materials in large quantities, from any pathway. There are no special restrictions, but the procurement of potion formulas will be handled by Lover. However, I can purchase extraordinary materials from any pathway in large batches." After a pause, Audrey continued, "As for compensation, how about 5% of the value of the items you provide?" Klein's eyes flickered slightly. No matter how many extraordinary materials and extraordinary characteristics he had, Miss Audrey could purchase them without limit. This was undoubtedly a transaction with guaranteed profit. As for the 5% compensation, it didn't sound like much, but it was actually quite a bit. Firstly, this kind of transaction was based on volume, so the compensation per unit would naturally be lower. Secondly, 5% compensation wasn't low. Klein had previously commissioned Emlyn to purchase the brain pituitary mutation in blood of the thousand-faced hunter, which cost a total of £2,300, plus an additional £150 in compensation for Emlyn, which was only equivalent to 6.5% of the total price of the items. As for Miss Justice entrusting the procurement of potion formulas to Ember, she certainly had her own reasons, but Klein had no intention of making money by selling potion formulas anyway. After all, potion formulas could be reused repeatedly, making it a one-time deal. Moreover, Klein himself had a batch of extraordinary characteristics that could be sold, and the income from this part alone already exceeded £10,000. Furs seemed to understand and suddenly spoke. "But I think you probably don't need potion formulas from the apprentice pathway either, but I have some extraordinary materials from the apprentice pathway. Do you want them?" "Yes," Audrey said without hesitation, "as much as you have." When she first met Miss Furs, she even regretted not choosing the apprentice pathway, and she certainly understood how useful the abilities of the apprentice pathway were. Furs kindly reminded her, "You need to think carefully. The apprentice pathway has no combat ability before sequence 6. Audrey smiled and said, "It's okay. If we cultivate a few more extraordinaries from the apprentice pathway, one of them will eventually reach sequence 6. Furs stopped trying to dissuade her. If she said that, what else could she say? At this moment, a thought simultaneously appeared in the minds of most members of the Tarot Club: being rich is truly willful. Hanged Man's eyes flickered slightly, and he suddenly asked, "Do you need magical items?" "Yes." Audrey nodded, but after thinking for a moment, she added, "But I don't accept just anything. I only want types with practical abilities and not too many side effects, and the corresponding compensation can also be increased to 10%. "No problem." Hanged Man nodded slightly, not surprised by Miss Justice's answer. However, he knew a craftsman friend whose ability in making magical items was quite outstanding, so he wasn't worried about the source of magical items. With no worries about the source or the market, he just needed to act as an intermediary and sacrifice the items to the fool. This kind of profitable business was worth doing. Little Sun hesitated for a moment and also spoke. "I should be able to obtain some extraordinary materials. Can I use these to repay the debt I owe you, Miss Justice?" "Of course." Audrey smiled faintly and also kindly reminded him, "I know Mr. Sun you don't need pounds, but you can accumulate them first. When you need them in the future, you can use these accumulated pounds to trade with other members." Little Sun thought for a moment, found it very reasonable, and immediately agreed. Soon, others also finalized some transaction details, and the Tarot Club gradually came to an end. Klein tapped the table lightly with his finger, attracting the attention of others. His gaze swept around, and he said calmly, "Today's gathering ends here. Queen's District, the luxurious villa of Earl Hall's family." The cold air was blocked by the windows and walls, and it was warm as spring inside, with an elegant fireplace. On the exquisite and beautiful luxury bed covered with a velvet duvet, the girl was sleeping peacefully with a smile on her face. In fact, her soul had long gone to the Fool, beyond the gray fog. And upon hearing Mr. Fool's voice announcing the end of the gathering, red light appeared before Audrey's eyes, and she felt a slight sense of falling. Immediately after, her vision returned to normal, and she saw the familiar ceiling. A pleasant smile played on her lips, but she quickly restrained it and patted her cheek. "Audrey, you can't be too proud." She quickly got out of bed and went to the door, gently opening it. The golden retriever Susie was faithfully squatting in the corridor, guarding the door for her. Seeing Audrey come out, Susie wagged her tail at her. "Susie, follow." Audrey beckoned to Susie, then turned to Annie, her personal maid who was also guarding the door, and asked, "Annie, where are father and them?" Annie bowed slightly. "Earl Hall and Lord Alfred are in the study." Audrey blinked and turned to walk towards the study on the second floor. And Susie, who had been half squatting on the ground, also stood up and followed, wagging her tail. Thump, thump, thump. The study door was knocked, interrupting Earl Hall and his son who were talking. Earl Hall frowned slightly, but Alfred across from him gave him a look, which immediately made Earl Hall's expression turn helpless, and he called out softly, "Audrey, come in." Click. Audrey gently pushed the door open. Earl Hall was sitting at his desk, while Alfred and his brother Hilbert were sitting on the study sofa. Audrey blinked and obediently went to Earl Hall's side to massage his shoulders, asking softly, "Father, are you worried about something?" Earl Hall didn't intend to hide it from his daughter. He shook his head and said, "Alfred is about to become a demigod, and the family must also cultivate enough extraordinaries to support the necessary foundation for a demigod family. Your brother and I have contacted channels to purchase extraordinary materials, but their prices are too exorbitant." Audrey asked curiously, "How much are they asking?" Earl Hall sighed. "On the basis of the market price, they are adding 50%. 50%. Audrey's delicate eyebrows furrowed. This price couldn't be called steep, it could only be called deliberately trying to rip off the Hall family. Earl Hall's channel was undoubtedly the royal family, while Alfred's channel was the military. Both of these had enough demigods. Therefore, they were not afraid of the Hall family, who only had a demigod spot, and even wanted to take the opportunity to extort them. In the end, it was because the Hall family's foundation was not deep enough and its history was not long enough. Alfred comforted him. "They are just asking for the sky. If we negotiate further, we should be able to reduce the price to below 30%. Earl Hall gently shook his head. "It's still too high." The Hall family was not short of money, but this didn't mean they would be happy to be extorted. As a qualified banker, Earl Hall was well aware of the principle. Once they compromised in this transaction, the other party would only become more aggressive. Even if they could reduce the price to 30% this time, the other party would raise it back to 50%, or even 60% next time. Audrey asked in confusion, "Father, brother, since they are asking too much, can't we cooperate with others?" Alfred sighed, helpless. "Audrey, you're thinking too simply. I know you're talking about the wild extraordinary gatherings, but the extraordinary materials in the hands of wild extraordinaries are quite limited, and they may not be what we need. Even attending 10 gatherings might not yield what we want once. To cultivate extraordinaries on a large scale, we can only find forces that hold extraordinary materials in large quantities. And the extraordinary materials required for the arbitrator and lawyer pathways mastered by the family are almost entirely concentrated in the hands of the royal family and the military. So we have no choice but to cooperate with them." Audrey retorted, "Why can it only be these two pathways? Can't other pathways work?" Alfred smiled wryly and patiently explained. "First, we don't have potion formulas for other pathways in our hands. Second, it's the same problem. We need to purchase extraordinary materials in large quantities, and wild extraordinaries cannot meet this condition unless we cooperate with secret organizations. But the consequences of cooperating with secret organizations are not something we can bear." Prince Edsac is a cautionary tale. Audrey blinked. "As for potions, we have them." Alfred was stunned for a moment. Hilbert immediately reacted and cleared his throat. "Actually, before you came back, Alfred, I bought some potion formulas and cultivated some extraordinaries privately." Alfred raised an eyebrow slightly and pressed on. "Where did you get your potion formulas from?" Hilbert glanced at Audrey out of the corner of his eye, subtly reminding him. "You know this person too." Alfred was stunned for a while and only finally reacted when he followed Hilbert's gaze to Audrey. Alfred rested his right fist against his chin and asked, "Which pathways can Ash provide potion formulas for?" Audrey smiled sweetly. "All pathways, but only up to sequence 5 at the highest." "That's enough." Alfred's tightly furrowed brows relaxed. He hadn't expected to obtain potion formulas above sequence 4 anyway. Earl Hall asked calmly, "What about extraordinary materials?" "Potion formulas aren't the problem, but Ash certainly can't provide extraordinary materials, right?" Audrey was prepared and said seriously, "I have a friend who can provide us with extraordinary materials in large quantities, and it's not limited to a specific pathway." Earl Hall pondered for 2 seconds and asked, "What's the price?" His bottom line was a 20% markup. If Audrey's friend offered a suitable price, he could consider it. As for who this friend was, those who knew would understand. A 5% markup on the market price. 5%. Earl Hall and his 2 sons exchanged glances, their eyes filled with disbelief. "Only a 5% markup? Are you running a charity?" Audrey emphasized. "Yes, 5%, but my friend has one requirement, which is that the total transaction amount must not be less than £200,000. Yes, she hadn't actually obtained Earl Hall's approval to purchase extraordinary materials. In fact, she just wanted to confirm the source first, and then take the source to Earl Hall to ask for the payment. Although she showed no expression on the surface, it was her first time doing something like this, and it was a case of acting first and reporting later, so Audrey was actually a little nervous inside. Her inspiration came from a little story about Rosal the Great. There was a young man who went to a bank and said he was the son-in-law of a rich man and wanted to be the bank's vice president. He then went to the rich man and said he was the bank's vice president and wanted to be his son-in-law. When both sides verified, they found the situation was true. So he became both the bank president and the rich man's son-in-law. Of course, if Earl Hall didn't agree, it didn't matter. Audrey's own small treasury still had £400,000. She could use her own money to fill this gap and wouldn't let the Tarot Club suffer any loss. Earl Hall immediately frowned. 200,000, Earl Hall said without hesitation. 200,000 is not enough, Audrey. Tell your friend, no matter what pathway the extraordinary materials are from, buy as much as possible. With only a 5% markup, they must buy as much as they can. Even if they couldn't use it themselves, with the Hall family's connections, they could completely sell it to other nobles with a markup. Buying at a 5% markup and finally selling at a 50% markup was a guaranteed profit. Chapter 186, The Lord Cares Greatly. January 5, 9 a.m., Wednesday. Klein, with a gray scarf wrapped around his neck, carrying a leather suitcase and a cane, arrived at Rose Dock. The white agate was moored there, exceptionally large relative to humans, said to be able to carry hundreds of passengers. It possessed the strong characteristics of this era, with both a chimney and sails, and 12 cannons and corresponding gun positions on each side of the hull. This was necessary for defense against pirates and rivals. Arranged by Captain Aylant Cag, the selected strong sailors and crew members lined up at the gangway entrance. Some even deliberately displayed their legal revolvers, rifles, and sabers. This gave the passengers boarding one after another a significant sense of security, no longer fearing the upcoming 9-day journey. Klein stood below, looked up, and walked onto the gangway from the undulating blue seawater. As soon as he stepped onto the deck, before he even had time to enter the cabin, Klein saw a lady standing on the deck, separate from the crowd, out of the corner of his eye. She had waist-length, naturally flowing chestnut hair, wore an olive-green dress, and a slightly old-fashioned black soft hat with a fine mesh veil hanging down to obscure her face. Although her features weren't visible, judging from her graceful figure, she was definitely a beautiful woman. However, perhaps it was just a misconception, but Klein always felt as if she was deliberately observing him. The moment this thought surfaced in his mind, the next second Klein saw the other party leave the deck and enter the cabin. I must be overthinking. Klein shook his head, not dwelling on it too much. He had probably read too many of Rosal's diaries, which made him have such wild thoughts. Meanwhile, on the other side, the lady with chestnut, waist-length hair had already entered the cabin and gone into the first-class cabin on the uppermost floor, room 310. First-class cabins were the best rooms on the ship, with a living room of about 30 square meters connected to a master bedroom and 3 servant rooms, an independent washroom, a standard wardrobe, and a mahogany desk. The lady sat down on the sofa in the living room, causing a noticeable indentation in the soft sofa cushion. And on the lady's shoulder, a small blue doll wearing a pointed hat quietly flew out and sat on the edge of the tea table. Bernadette looked at the small doll before her and asked softly, "Why are you paying attention to him?" The small doll raised its head, revealing its eyes beneath the pointed hat, and said calmly, He has the blessing of the golden tree on him, but he is not a fated one, and this is not the land of between. Bernadette didn't know what a fated one was, nor the land of between, but she still understood and said softly. His name is Gehrman Sparrow, but this is a fake identity. Is he related to the king? The small doll's fingertips met, and it said calmly. The king trusts him. Do you need me to do anything? Just observe. Bernadette nodded slightly. They had not originally planned to sail on this ship. It was only because they happened to encounter that Gehrman Sparrow midway that they bought this ticket from a generous lady. As for Gehrman Sparrow's true identity, it wasn't difficult to investigate. After all, this identity was originally fabricated by Bernadette. Backland, North District. Ember arrived at Pesfield Street in the North District by carriage. Here stood a pure black church with a bell tower on each side, presenting a symmetrical beauty. This was the headquarters of the Church of the Night Goddess Beckland Diocese, St. Samuel Cathedral. Ember did not teleport but walked into the church, passed through the quiet corridor, and under the rare winter sunlight piercing through the high stained glass windows, arrived at the main prayer hall. It was very dim here, making people feel peaceful involuntarily. Believers sat on rows of black chairs with backs, praying with their eyes closed, fully focused on the goddess. Time passed minute by minute. After listening to the sermon, the believers slowly rose, walked towards the altar, bowed to the bishop with very short black hair, and then came to the nearby offering box to deposit the prepared cash. This was not a mandatory act, but it had become a routine. And the believers were also happy to donate to the church, which made them feel devout enough. However, the amount of donations varied among different social classes. Commoners usually donated a few pennies each time, the middle class 3 to 5 solely, and the wealthy and nobles counted in pounds. This was determined based on family circumstances and was also a symbol of class and status. Therefore, the middle class and the wealthy were usually very willing to donate more money to show that they were in a different class from commoners. But Ember was not a believer of the goddess, nor did he plan to donate money. So he just sat there, quietly watching the believers line up to donate and then leave the church. As time passed, even the bishop with short black hair had left, leaving only Ember in the church. But soon, another figure emerged from the door at the back of the main prayer hall. It was an old man wearing a black clerical robe with red trim, clean-shaven, with deep-set eyes. It was Archbishop St. Anthony. Archbishop St. Anthony walked towards the same row of seats as Ember, sat down in the adjacent seat, and smiled as if chatting with a friend. Benefactor, you seem to need help. Archbishop St. Anthony could feel Ember's confusion, a kind of helplessness from losing direction and motivation. He had seen many such people, most of whom had their lives turned upside down due to changes in their families and careers. They didn't know what to do, and in their confusion, they came to the church seeking confession and guidance. Of course, this was just a metaphor. Archbishop St. Anthony could clearly feel Ember's difference from others. He was somewhat confused but had not lost his direction. This was undoubtedly somewhat contradictory and also made Archbishop St. Anthony a little surprised and puzzled, not knowing what the benefactor truly wanted or what he was searching for. Ember looked at the altar, where bright sunlight piercing through the stained glass cast pure and faint highlights. They connected with the surrounding almost night-like environment, with alternating light and dark, transforming into a sublime starry sky. He suddenly asked, Archbishop Anthony, can outsiders enter the church's painting world? Of course. Archbishop St. Anthony smiled and nodded. As I said a long time ago, you can enter the church's painting world at any time. There's no need for an additional application. I will inform the St. Hall in advance. No. Ember gently shook his head and slowly said, I mean the painting worlds of other churches. Archbishop St. Anthony was stunned for a moment and immediately realized that Ember still did not want to enter the painting world held by the church right now. Besides the churches, there were a total of 5 other painting worlds held by other forces, belonging to the Earth Mother Church, the Church of Steam and Machinery, and the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, the 3 great churches, as well as the Aurora Order and Dawn of Elements, 2 major secret organizations. Archbishop St. Anthony fell silent, feeling somewhat puzzled, but quickly gave a reply, saying slowly, I will try to contact the representatives of other churches. However, benefactor, if you wish to enter the painting world held by other forces, I suggest starting with Dawn of Elements. Dawn of Elements. Ember withdrew his gaze from the altar and asked in surprise, why? Among the forces that possessed painting worlds, Dawn of Elements was undoubtedly the weakest. Even among secret organizations, Dawn of Elements ranked low in strength. After all, the original purpose of establishing this organization was to oppose the Moses ascetic order. It controlled the Hermit pathway and the Wheel of Fortune pathway, integrating elements from various schools of mysticism, and had its own set of theories. Its members were skilled in casting spells and mastered many ancient sorceries, but they uniquely lacked their own gods. And this also meant that the members of this organization could not and would not receive the protection of gods, and developing members would be quite difficult. But precisely because of this, this organization appeared exceptionally low-key compared to secret organizations like the Aurora Order. Because they had no gods to worship, they had no need to spread faith or develop believers, and they rarely came into contact with other organizations, leading many people to have never even heard the name, Dawn of Elements. However, Ember wanted to enter the painting world, not seize it, and for a little-known secret organization like Dawn of Elements, Ember didn't even know who its members were or where they were located, so naturally, he couldn't contact them and thus couldn't enter the painting world they possessed. In contrast, even the Aurora Order's painting world would be easier to enter than Dawn of Elements. However, he had already been to the Aurora Order's painting world once, so the other three great churches should be his first choice. Archbishop St. Anthony smiled and explained. Benefactor, you should still remember Bernadette Gustave. She is the founder of Dawn of Elements. A flicker of understanding flashed in Ember's eyes. Since Bernadette was the founder of Dawn of Elements, she must know the location of the painting world controlled by Dawn of Elements perfectly. Asking her for help would undoubtedly be the quickest way, but unfortunately, he couldn't. Because during the Backland Great Smog incident, she had already repaid the favor, she owed Ember nothing. Ember pondered for 2 seconds and slowly said, "Let's start with the three great churches." "All right." Archbishop St. Anthony nodded gently, not offering any suggestions regarding Ember's decision, and smiled. "I will contact the representatives of the other churches. Please be patient, Benefactor. I will inform you as soon as there is a result." Although the painting world was one of the foundations of the three great churches and was usually kept in the saint halls of the major three great churches, it was not entirely impossible for outsiders to access it. Especially when the Church of the Night, also one of the three great churches, was negotiating, it was not a difficult matter. Of course, even among the three great churches, it depended on who was asking. For example, regarding the painting world held by the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, if people from the Eternal Blazing Sun Church and the Storm Church were to negotiate, they would definitely be directly driven out by the people of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. After all, these three great churches had always been incompatible, and merely meeting could potentially lead to a fight. If not for this, these three great churches would not belong to three different countries, having nothing to do with each other. Okay. Ember slowly stood up, extended his hand to Archbishop St. Anthony, and said softly, "Goodbye, Archbishop Anthony." Archbishop St. Anthony also smiled and extended his hand to shake his. "Goodbye." Backland Queen's District, in a hidden house. In the house's spacious basement, which resembled a temple, several candles flickered with yellowish flames, illuminating the altars, chairs, round tables, and a statue nearly 3 meters tall placed around. It was a hanged man with his legs bound by chains connecting upwards. This hanged man had the giant's unique vertical single eye, with his arms extended horizontally, forming a cross. Mr. A, wearing a hooded black robe, knelt before the statue, hidden in the gloom, whispering something devoutly. At the edge of the light, in an extremely dark area, a figure was vaguely present, sometimes swaying, sometimes stretching, a thin layer without thickness, like a living shadow. Dark Saint. Mr. A sensed the arrival and respectfully lowered his head. The Dark Saint's gaze moved downwards, looking at Mr. A kneeling before the statue, and said in a low voice, "You have done very well." Mr. A's expression instantly became fanatical, raising his hands. "Praise my Lord." The Dark Saint silently watched Mr. A complete his prayer, and then asked, "Has anything happened recently?" "No." Mr. A carefully recalled and shook his head. "Since George III was assassinated and the royal family severed contact with us, that side has not contacted us again. I also secretly infiltrated that ruin, but found nothing. That ruin seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving no trace. Besides that, the Saint of Mysteries has sent messages multiple times, questioning the death of Mr. X." The Dark Saint's expression remained unchanged, and his tone was indifferent. "Ignore him. They crossed the line themselves. Even if they died, it's not our fault. If he comes to question again, just tell him to come find me directly, and I will explain to him personally. Besides, don't break contact with that side, that one might still need us next time." After a second's pause, he said slowly, "This is the Lord's instruction." Although the Saint of Mysteries and the Dark Saint were both demigods of the Aurora Order and had no conflicts, on the contrary, they had collaborated several times to their mutual satisfaction, when it came to matters concerning the Lord, everyone had to step aside. Mr. X's unauthorized arrival in Backland, crossing the line to hunt down members of the Abraham family, was already breaking the rules. What's more, he was involved with that side, so even if he died in vain. In fact, even if he hadn't died, the Dark Saint would have personally killed him to avoid delaying the Lord's great plan because of him. After a brief thought, the Dark Saint suddenly took out a picture frame covered with a black cloth from the shadows, handed it to Mr. A, and instructed. This is a new entrance. If that side contacts us again, you can actively invite him to enter it. The Lord wants to see him. Understood. Mr. A respectfully lowered his head, having no objection to this. Chapter 187. Don't wait anymore, he won't come. Woo. Amidst the sound of the whistle, the White Agate sailed into Demir Port on the evening of January 8. It would replenish fresh water and food on this colonial island and set sail again the next morning. Perhaps because it was still coastal waters, they didn't encounter any danger along the way. Only a lost merman climbed onto the ship and was hunted by Klein. As for this merman, Klein's evaluation was only 2 words: very smooth. The merman's meat was very smooth, firm and solid, emitting a lingering elasticity and meaty aroma when chewed, better than all the fish Klein had eaten in Backland and Pritz Harbor. Life along the way could be said to be quite leisurely, or quite boring. Klein, completely bored with the scenery at sea, decided to explore a port bar at night while the ship was docked, hoping to gain more mermaid intelligence and find inspiration for acting. Of course, there was a more important reason. Klein had a commission from Ember to find Danitz on Demir Island. Klein sorted out his thoughts and left the cabin, sweating, walking towards the gangway to disembark. During this process, he met Creeves, who had hunted mermen with him on the ship, and the employer's family he protected. They were preparing to go to a port restaurant to taste Demir's most famous cured meat. Klein stepped down to the port, but just as he was about to leave, a strong intuition suddenly surged in his heart. Someone was watching him. Klein turned his head alertly. On the deck of the White Agate, a lady with waist-length chestnut hair was standing by the rail, quietly watching him. Klein calmly withdrew his gaze. The lady had been observing him since he boarded the ship. Perhaps it was because she sensed his unusualness and felt threatened. But they hadn't known each other before, and coupled with the peace and quiet of the past few days, Klein didn't think the other party would suddenly attack. The other party's observation was likely habitual, a certain degree of surveillance on potentially threatening targets, which was not unusual and didn't require special attention. Klein didn't take this matter to heart. Following the signs, he successfully found the nearest bar. Flying Fish and Wine. Klein glanced at the sign and found that the bar's door was covered with various wanted posters. Among them were £800,000 belonging to the King of the Five Seas, as well as hundreds of pounds for ordinary pirate captains, layered from high to low, forming a unique scene. It's all money. Klein stopped in place and watched for a good while. Withdrawing his gaze, he pushed the door and entered the bar, finding it unusually quiet, lacking the necessary noise for such an occasion. Klein ignored the atmosphere inside the bar, turned and sat on a high stool in front of the bar, and lightly tapped the wooden counter. A glass of South Wales beer. 6 pence. The bartender, with bronze skin and white teeth, wiped a glass and said without any enthusiasm. Klein counted out 6 pence and handed it over, asking nonchalantly. Do you know Danitz? I heard he's on this island. Ember had only asked him to find Danitz on Demir Island, but hadn't provided contact information or a code phrase for a meeting. This meant there was no prior arrangement between the two parties, and the other party didn't know when Ember would return or where they should meet. The only clue was the location of Demir Island. But Demir Island was large, and because it was located near the coast and close to the ruined kingdom, the population here was not sparse. Even if Ember and Danitz knew each other, it wouldn't be easy to aimlessly search for someone in a vast crowd. Based on this situation, the wisest choice was to find a location that was highly recognizable and where both parties would pass through or arrive. This location was the port. Ember, departing by ship from the ruined kingdom, would definitely pass through Demir Port. And Danitz, as long as he wasn't stupid, would surely wait for Ember at Demir Port. But even so, Demir Port was too large, so it was necessary to narrow it down to a more precise location, a place both parties would go to. And this bar, the closest to the port, was the best choice. If nothing went wrong, Danitz should leave clues here. This was a very simple logical deduction. The bartender gave him a deep look, handed him a glass of beer, and shook his head, saying, "Don't know him. What do you need him for?" Klein took a sip of beer and said calmly, "A private matter. Someone commissioned me to bring a message to him and his captain." "Are you sure you really don't know Danitz?" As long as Danitz wasn't stupid, he would definitely leave clues here, so Klein wasn't in a hurry. "I said, I don't know him." The bartender's attitude remained cold. Just then, a short, thin man carrying his drink sat down next to Klein. "Buddy, you look like an adventurer." He tilted his head slightly and greeted Klein. The man who greeted him had black hair and blue eyes, looked older than his age, and had a rather lewd demeanor. "You could say that," Klein responded coldly. The short man didn't mind his coldness and smiled instead. "Are you looking for Danitz? I'm a Sea Eagle, Logan, a famous information broker in this area. And I happen to know clues about Danitz. I think you should be interested." Klein finished the beer in his glass, his expression unchanged, and said in a flat tone. "Where is he? That's a long story. We need to have a good chat, talk while eating." Sea Eagle, Logan didn't answer his question. Instead, he slapped the bar counter and said to the bartender, "Bring a plate of special cured meat. I'll treat this buddy to a taste of our most famous Demir delicacy." The bartender, still with that cold face, pushed the door into the back kitchen and quickly brought out a plate of sliced cured meat, clearly red and white, with fine texture. 5 pounds. He didn't look at Logan, but directly at Klein. 5 pounds. Sea Eagle, Logan turned his head, smiling warmly, and raised his arm, showing off his muscles. "Everyone just heard it. You're going to treat me to the special cured meat to thank me." Klein didn't immediately react to what had happened. It wasn't until the bartender urged him a second time that he realized he was being extorted. "Why not just rob me directly? Why not just rob you directly?" Logan was a bit stunned by the question. Immediately after, he saw a fist getting bigger and bigger. Beckland North District, St. Samuel Cathedral. It was already late at night. Even the most devout believers rarely prayed at this time. The large prayer hall, bustling with people during the day, was almost empty at this time. Ember sat quietly in the middle of the first row, surrounded by darkness and silence. Only the relatively bright scarlet moonlight, streaming through the stained glass windows high up, fell onto the altar, dyeing it a crimson color. Outsiders might find this scene somewhat blasphemous, but for devout goddess believers, they wouldn't feel blasphemous. Instead, they would become even more devout. Because one of the goddess's honorific titles is precisely the Scarlet Moon. Step, step, footsteps approached from a distance. Archbishop St. Anthony, wearing a black robe with red clerical trim, walked towards the first row of seats and stopped. "Benefactor," Archbishop Anthony slowly said, "the Steam Church has agreed to our negotiation. They will send a team of Mechanical Heart members to Trier. Benefactor will travel with them then. Upon arrival in Trier, the person in charge of the Steam Church will lead you into the painting world. Trier is the capital of the Intis Republic. The Saint Hall of the Steam Church and the Eternal Blazing Sun Church are both there. In this regard, many countries are actually similar. The Saint Hall of the Church of the God of War is in St. Milan, the capital of the Fosak Empire. The Saint Hall of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom is in Esiala, the capital of Leuenberg. The Saint Hall of the Earth Mother Church is in Finepotter City, the capital of the Fenaport Kingdom. The Ruined Kingdom, however, is an exception. The capital of the Ruined Kingdom is Backland. But among the kingdom's two major mainstream churches, the Saint Hall of the Church of the Night is in Winter County in the north, located within the Amanda Mountains, while the Saint Hall of the Storm Church is located on Passu Island at sea. Ember withdrew his gaze from the altar bathed in scarlet moonlight, thought for a moment, and asked, "When do we depart?" "In 2 days. 2 days later, which is January 10th. Ember nodded lightly, not surprised by this result. The Steam Church is the only true God church that can preach across 2 countries, which has created the spectacle of 3 true God churches preaching simultaneously in the Ruined Kingdom. To achieve this, the relationship between the Steam Church and the Church of the Night would naturally not be bad. Therefore, the Steam Church would not easily refuse the Church of the Night's requests, as long as they weren't too excessive. In fact, the main reason the Steam Church can maintain good relations with other churches is that there are no irreconcilable conflicts of interest between the Steam and Machinery God and the other true gods. Archbishop Anthony explained, "The Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom and the Earth Mother Church are still in negotiation. The negotiation should be completed before Benefactor arrives in Trier. By then, Benefactor can go directly south to Leuenberg or the Fenaport Kingdom. And before you go to Trier, I think I need to explain some issues to you." Archbishop Anthony paused. Seeing that Ember didn't show any impatience, he continued, "I think you should know that the Steam Church is a true God church established only in the 4th epoch. Therefore, they originally didn't have a painting world. The painting world they currently possess originally belonged to the Eternal Blazing Sun Church. More than 100 years ago, when Rosal established the Intis Empire, a certain transaction was reached between him and the 2 major churches of the Intis Empire. The Eternal Blazing Sun Church transferred the painting world to the Steam Church in exchange for certain hidden benefits and support. And the painting world possessed by the Dawn of Elements originally belonged to the Storm Church. Rosal personally took action and stole it from Backland. Ember was slightly surprised. Backland. Archbishop Anthony nodded gently and explained. Historically, Backland was once the headquarters of the Lord of Storm's church. It wasn't until the end of the Fourth Epoch, when the Ruined Kingdom was established, that they moved the altar to Passu Island. But for some reason, the painting world was not moved along with it and remained in Backland. After Rosal's death, this painting world was also left to his daughter Bernadette, becoming one of the foundations of the Dawn of Elements. When these two painting worlds still belonged to the Eternal Blazing Sun Church and the Storm Church, the churches had sent people to explore them to a certain extent. Some details were recorded, and these materials are now preserved in St. Samuel Cathedral. Benefactor, if you have time before going to Trier, you can come to the church to review them at any time. However, now that these two painting worlds are in the hands of the Steam Church and the Dawn of Elements, their internal structures may have undergone some changes. Ember asked thoughtfully. Where are the materials? Archbishop Anthony slowly said. Behind Channy's gate. Bang. Klein drew his revolver and used the butt to knock out Sea Eagle, Logan, who had just been beaten up. He held up his body, took out a handful of scattered banknotes and coins from his pocket, threw them onto the bar counter, and said coldly. Your medical expenses. Keep the change. The bartender's bronze face turned pale, and he cried out in panic. My boss is White Shark. Bang. Before the bartender could finish speaking, Klein pressed down hard, smashing the bartender's head onto the bar counter. Wood chips flew everywhere, blood flowed out, the patrons scattered, and the guard rushed over at high speed. But before the guard arrived, Klein had already easily left the Flying Fish and Wine bar. He adjusted his hat, walked quickly, and turned into the adjacent street. After changing direction several times, he suddenly slowed down, and a gold coin appeared in his hand. The gold coin kept flipping between his fingers, seemingly scouting something. Clink. The gold coin lightly flipped up, tumbled down, and landed steadily in Klein's palm. Glancing down to see if it was heads or tails, Klein pivoted on his heel and smoothly turned into a secluded, dark alley. Suddenly, Klein stopped, turned his body, and said in a low voice. Come out. His gaze was sharp, fixed on the shadow around the corner. After 4 or 5 seconds of silence, a figure grew out of the darkness and chuckled. Very sharp. This was a man wearing a black cloak, appearing to be around 30 years old. His eyebrows were yellowish-brown, his eyes deep blue but bright, and his features weren't too sharp, resembling people from the southern part of Intis, Leuenberg, and Siegel. What do you want? Klein, maintaining his persona, slightly lowered his back, like a giant feline creature ready to pounce. The man in the black cloak had a strange expression and chuckled. You ask what I want to do. Aren't you looking for me? Danitz. Klein frowned slightly. Yes. Danitz threw back his cloak, revealing his face, a slight smile on his lips. Underling of Iceberg Admiral Edwina Edwards, 4th mate of the Golden Dream, Fiery Danitz. After announcing his nickname, real name, and identity, Danitz patiently waited for the other party to show expressions of panic and fear. A second later, he heard the adventurer, who appeared refined and polite but acted slightly crazed, speak in a low voice. Fiery Danitz with a 3,000-pound bounty. Just as Danitz was about to answer, he suddenly had a strange illusion. The person standing in the dark alley had transformed into an indescribable monster filled with hunger, drooling over his soul and flesh. Danitz suddenly clenched his fists. His body lost its previous relaxation, tensing up to the point of slight trembling. His intuition told him that he was facing an abyss filled with madness and bloodlust. Klein said calmly, You're lucky. Someone asked me to bring you a message. Danitz forced himself to stay composed, trying not to show fear, and asked calmly. Who? Ash Black. Klein said calmly, He asked me to tell you that you don't need to keep waiting for him on Demir Island. Really? Danitz was originally a bit nervous, but upon hearing this sentence, his mood suddenly became cheerful. He had been waiting on Demir Island for 3 months. 3 months. Do you know how he got through these 3 months? Now he finally didn't have to wait anymore. He could finally return to the Golden Dream and see the captain. Danitz was incredibly excited, so excited he wanted to cry. Ash is a good person. Klein watched the changes in the other party's expression and slowly said. He also asked you to bring a message. Danitz was in a great mood, and even his tone became a bit kinder. He asked friendly. What message? He wants you to go back and find Iceberg Admiral, and tell her not to wait for him anymore. Danitz, who was originally in a cheerful mood, suddenly froze. What does, don't wait for him anymore, mean? Chapter 188. Within the spiderweb, only the spider is safe. On January 9, the White Agate arrived at Bansi Island at 6 in the evening. According to the normal plan, the White Agate would leave Demir Port and its next stop would be Tiana Port, which would take about 3 days of sailing at a speed of 13 knots to reach. After leaving Tiana Port, it would head directly to the final destination, Byam, the capital of the Rothschild Islands, the city of generosity. There was a faster route from Pritz Harbor to Byam, which was to only stop once midway, at Bansi Harbor, 120 nautical miles from Demir Port. However, they had encountered pirates just after leaving Demir Port during the day. Although the other party eventually left in a hurry for some unknown reason and no actual conflict occurred, it should be known that the route they were currently on still belonged to the safe, coastal waters, frequently patrolled by the kingdom's navy fleets and church ships. Even when the 4 kings and 7 generals passed through nearby waters, they would try to keep a low profile and not attract attention. But the appearance of that pirate ship made Aelin, the captain of the White Agate, feel something unusual, which is why he temporarily decided to dock at Bansi Harbor in the evening to report the pirate encounter to the navy and the church. Bansi Harbor. Aelin is quite cautious. Danit stood by the window, looking at the already dim harbor and the tall lighthouse. The pirate group the White Agate encountered had originally intended to plunder them, but because the bounty of 3,000 pounds for Flame Danitz was somewhat well known, more than 3 times higher than the 900-pound bounty of that pirate group's captain, the other party retreated upon realizing the difficulty. But Aelin didn't know this, which is why he decided to report the situation of this unusual pirate group to the navy and the church. Even without knowing the truth of the matter, Aelin's decision was not wrong. After all, this is at sea, and no amount of caution is too much. Klein didn't respond, and Danitz wasn't surprised. He chuckled to himself. There seemed to be some unpleasant legends here. Klein had initially figured out Danitz's personality and didn't actively ask what legends there were. He remained seated in the chair, calmly watching the other person. Uninterrupted, Danitz shook his head. Legend has it that more than 300 years ago, when Ruin's army first occupied this island, over 500 soldiers mysteriously disappeared after a thick fog. Not long after, their bodies appeared by the sea, on the mountains. But without exception, they were all skinned. Some suspected it was the local natives, because according to the unearthed tombs and murals on the island, the natives here seemed to have a tradition of cannibalism. But when those bodies were found, although the flesh and blood had begun to rot, they were remarkably well preserved, just simply skinned. Similar things happened several times, and even the Storm Church deacon who came to investigate couldn't escape, until the Storm Church built a church here and dispatched a bishop. Danitz paused, as if waiting for someone to ask, but Klein just watched him calmly. This made Danitz feel a bit helpless, but he didn't want to stop here, so he continued to speak slowly, as if deliberately creating suspense. Finally, that bishop was also skinned, and his body was hung at the entrance of the church. Danitz chuckled lightly. Of course, the Storm Church certainly couldn't tolerate such a thing happening, so they sent another archbishop. Archbishop, a demigod. Klein's eyes flickered. In his understanding, only saints could hold the position of archbishop. For example, the archbishops of the 3 great churches in the Beckland diocese are at least sequence 4 saints. And a bishop's strength is likely above a deacon, at least a sequence 5 extraordinary. Even a sequence 5 extraordinary was skinned and hung at the entrance of their own church. The hot-tempered Storm Church members would definitely not swallow this insult, so it was reasonable for them to send a saint to regain face. Klein didn't want to push Danitz too hard, as he was indeed interested in this legend. So he spoke indifferently. What happened later? Danitz had been waiting here for a long time, and the corners of his mouth curved slightly. That archbishop had just arrived at Bansi Harbor, and on the very same night, he was skinned, and his body was hung at the entrance of the church, swaying in the wind. Klein looked at him deeply. An archbishop is at least at the saint level. That's why I said it's just a legend. Danitz shrugged, not arguing with him, just saying slowly. The death of an archbishop completely enraged the Storm Church. Finally, their pope personally took action and completely eliminated the threat on Bansi Island, and this history was subsequently hidden. Without waiting for Klein's reply, Danitz continued to speak to himself. I know you must be wondering how I know this history since it's been hidden, right? It's simple, because I'm an archaeologist. Danitz puffed out his chest proudly, but Klein just glanced at him with indifferent eyes. He neither wanted to ask that question nor believed that Danitz was a so-called archaeologist. He likely heard these things from his captain. Before setting sail, he had specifically inquired about the situation at sea, the most important information being the 4 kings and 7 generals. And according to the information provided by the hanged man, Iceberg Admiral Edwina is one of the pirate generals. But she doesn't plunder passing merchant ships, she is more interested in lost treasures and legends at sea. And this legend about Bansi Harbor was likely unearthed by Edwina. If that's the case, the credibility of the legend should be quite high. And it's also very likely that the Storm Church, having lost face in Bansi Harbor, chose to hide this dark history. To be able to kill an archbishop of the Storm Church, there must be at least a saint of the same level on the island. Beings of this level are mostly affiliated with a certain organization. But Klein had never heard of an organization that enjoys skinning. The only one similar is the Blood Sect. This hidden organization formed by worshipping demons is most fond of performing bloody and terrifying rituals with corpses. And skinning, perhaps, is also part of its ritual. Klein's expression shifted slightly. He tapped the table with his finger and asked indifferently, "What else do you know?" "I don't know much either." Danitz was reserved for 2 seconds, but the rising corner of his mouth couldn't hide his strong desire to show off. He said slowly, "I only know that the natives of Bansi Island once believed in and sacrificed to a self-created god of weather, performing 4 rituals every year." Klein asked calmly, "So, the one who killed that archbishop was this god of weather? Is skinning part of the ritual?" "No." Danitz looked at Bansi Harbor, which was getting closer and closer outside the window, his eyes becoming deeper. The content of the god of weather's sacrifice ritual was to kill the chosen god favored, share his blood and flesh, and bury the head in the altar. Skinning was not included. Moreover, he paused for 2 seconds, his tone somber. There is evidence that that god of weather has no connection to the skinning ritual. The ones truly doing all this are an organization calling themselves the Skin Taker Messenger. They believe in the Queen with Twilight Eyes, who is said to be the goddess of the night representing death. Goddess of the night. Klein's inner emotions became quite subtle. A group of Skin Taker Messenger, who skin people, claiming to be followers of the goddess. Isn't this like blood for the emperor, skulls for the golden throne? You've worshipped the wrong god, brother. Danitz shrugged. Obviously, this is undoubtedly the greatest blasphemy for the Church of the Night. So the organization, Skin Taker Messenger, disappeared quickly after it just appeared, under the joint eliminate, encirclement and annihilation of the Storm Church and the Church of the Night. And both great churches tacitly chose to hide this history. This also led to very few people having heard of the hidden organization, Skin Taker Messenger, and even if they have, they don't know much about their organizational structure. For example, what is the identity of the Queen with Twilight Eyes they believe in? And why did she suddenly appear in Bansi? Klein suddenly grasped a word and asked back with a serious expression. Bansi. Yes, that's the old name for Bansi Harbor. 300 or 400 years ago, it was called Bansi Town, and later, due to pronunciation and other factors, it gradually evolved into Bansi, Danitz casually explained. Hearing this answer, Klein's eyes narrowed instantly. He remembered very clearly that the Wraith in the Backland underground ruins had said that if he wanted to find one of the founders of the Redemption Rose, the former Angel King Medici and his bloodline descendants, he could try his luck in Bansi Town. Bansi. Klein's mind felt as if it was freezing inch by inch, coldness emanating from the depths of his bones. The place name Bansi, mentioned by the Wraith in the underground ruins, coupled with the legends and customs Danitz told him, made him feel a chill. So, he took out a gold coin and performed a divination in front of Danitz. The result was that for him, there was no hidden danger in Bansi Harbor. But this didn't reassure Klein. He suddenly stood up and walked into the washroom. Klein took out the paper figure, disguised himself, and walked 4 steps counterclockwise to enter the pool. He sat at the head of the bronze long table, took off the pendulum from his left wrist, and wrote the corresponding divination statement. There is a hidden danger in Bansi Harbor. He lowered the pendulum, assumed the posture, and after muttering it a few times, Klein opened his eyes and saw the yellow crystal pendant rotating clockwise, but the amplitude was small and the speed was not fast. There is danger, but it's not great. Klein rested his elbows on the edge of the bronze long table and muttered to himself. Thinking about it, it makes sense. This place has been occupied by the Ruined Kingdom for more than 300 years. If there was danger, something would have happened here long ago, and it wouldn't have become an important transit point for going to the Rothschild Islands. What's more, it has been cleaned up by the joint efforts of the Church of the Night and the Storm Church. Even if there were some unclean things before, they would have been completely cleaned up by now. However, Klein's eyes were deep. He suddenly remembered another issue he had overlooked. That underground ruin, and the Wraith inside. Half a month ago, he had discussed with Sharon about asking Ember to explore that underground ruin. Because neither he nor Sharon had enough strength to fully explore the underground ruin, the Wraith alone was enough to completely block their path to exploration. In this situation, asking others for help was a reluctant choice, but it was also the wisest. After all, instead of waiting for others to discover and explore the ruins, or letting the Wraith in the underground ruins escape, It was better to find someone strong enough and trustworthy to explore the underground ruins, so that they wouldn't return empty-handed at least. Klein had informed Ember of this information through the mouth of Mr. World at the Tarot Club. But at that time, Ember was busy dealing with the Black Emperor's matters, so the underground ruin was temporarily put aside, and it was originally supposed to be explored after the new year. But Klein still hadn't sent the specific information to Ember until now. It wasn't that he didn't want to, it was that he forgot. If it weren't for Danitz suddenly mentioning Bensi, which stirred Klein's memories, he wouldn't have remembered the matter of the underground ruin at all. If it were an ordinary person, it would be normal to occasionally forget one or two less important things. But Klein is a Sequence 6 extraordinary. Even if he is not an extraordinary from the Savant's pathway, his memory is definitely not comparable to ordinary people. Even though a series of things piled up after the new year, leaving Klein with little time for other matters. But how could he easily forget such an important matter? I've been affected. Klein's face sank. This was an easy conclusion to draw. Someone was deliberately making him forget things related to that ruin, but this ability was definitely not directly acting on him through hypnosis or entering dreams, otherwise he would have noticed the abnormality on him the moment he entered the Fool. And this ability, this familiar feeling, made Klein extremely familiar with it. It was the ability of 008. That sealed artifact can use a series of coincidences to push the plot forward, making things develop in the direction the other party wants. But if it were just simple coincidences, Klein would have noticed. Having suffered losses twice already, he was particularly sensitive to coincidences. If he had to describe it, it was like the previous person who influenced him, in Zhangwil, was a clumsy third-rate writer, so he had to use a lot of abrupt coincidences to make things develop in the direction he wanted. And the one influencing Klein now is a real writer. Hiss. Klein took a deep breath. He felt as if he was in a dense spiderweb, unable to escape no matter how hard he struggled. This feeling sent shivers down his spine. But Klein could also clearly realize that the target of this web was not him, and he himself was even a part of this web. Klein didn't know who was planning all this, or what the purpose was, but he knew how to make a hole in this dense web. Since the other party wanted him to forget about the underground ruin, he would deliberately publicize it, especially tell Ember. I'll dig up your grave for you, let's see what you'll use to scheme. Chapter 189, Backland, William Street. Above the boundless gray fog, the magnificent palace stood silently. Klein sat quietly in the position belonging to the Fool, while opposite the mottled bronze long table was Mr. World, shrouded in the gray fog. He was waiting for someone, waiting for Ember. Upon realizing that someone had deliberately blurred his memory of that underground ruin, Klein did not hesitate to pass this information to Ember. Of course, this information was reported to the Fool in the form of a prayer, acting as Mr. World, and then the Fool relayed it to Ember. It's about time. Klein pressed open his pocket watch, checked the time, and then extended his spirituality to touch the cluster of flames representing Ember. Soon, a figure appeared on one side of the bronze long table. It was Ember. Klein didn't hesitate and immediately controlled Mr. World to speak in a hoarse voice. Mr. Lovers, the underground ruin I mentioned to you last time is on William Street. I originally wanted to tell you the location of the ruin immediately after the new year, but a certain existence secretly influenced me, making me subconsciously ignore any information about this underground ruin. I suspect that behind this underground ruin, a shocking conspiracy is likely hidden. Quote. The previous prayer only briefly explained the issue, so this time Klein explained it in great detail. Ember also listened carefully to Mr. World's narration and nodded slightly. I will go investigate immediately. Where are you now? Klein didn't hide anything and replied. Bensi Harbor. Its ancient name is Bensi. According to that evil spirit, this is the residence of the blood descendants of the Medici family. According to the evil spirit, as long as you find the direct descendants of the Sauron, Einhorn, and Medici families, obtain 10 milliliters of blood from each, mix them with holy water, and sprinkle it into the room where the target is located, you can break its seal. Klein told Ember all the information the evil spirit had told him, down to the smallest detail. After all, Ember was about to explore that underground ruin, and this information might be of some help to him. Medici. Ember caught a word and asked back. Yes. Klein nodded slightly and explained, although this family is not as prominent as the Sauron and Einhorn families, being able to stand alongside them means their strength is absolutely not to be underestimated. Their ancestor Medici should have been an angel king, and also one of the first founders of the Redemption Rose. After a second's pause, Klein added. Furthermore, the Medici family is suspected to have mastered the Hunter sequence, which is the Red Priest sequence. This means that the title of that angel king should have been Red Angel or War Angel. Is that so? Ember nodded thoughtfully, but what he didn't say was that the reason he asked about Medici was not because he didn't know the family, but quite the opposite, he had met the ancestor of this family. Although it was only a brief meeting, among the followers of the ancient sun god, Medici was the one who left the deepest impression on him. There's one more thing. Klein hesitated for 2 seconds, controlling Mr. World to say hoarsely, I heard a legend on Bansi Island related to a secret organization called the Skin Taker Messenger. Klein briefly recounted the legend Danitz had told him, paused, and then asked, do you have any suggestions? Ember's expression was a bit surprised. Skin Apostle. Skin Taker Messenger, Klein corrected. Ember shook his head slightly and said, I only know about the Skin Apostle, they are followers of the Queen with Eyes of Twilight. Then it matches. Klein's expression became serious. The Skin Taker Messenger also believed in the Queen with Eyes of Twilight. Do you know anything about this organization? Klein hesitated for a moment and asked. Although the divination showed there was no danger on Bansi Island and this so-called organization called the Skin Taker Messenger had already been wiped out, there was no harm in learning more information, especially since it was free. Ember pondered for a moment and slowly said, I don't know much about them, but if you have to liken them to an organization, its members should be divided into Skin Taker Messengers and Skin Taker Nobles, who believe in the Queen with Eyes of Twilight, who hold sway over destined death. Klein's eyes flickered, and he asked, what about the Queen with Eyes of Twilight? He didn't know what level of existence the Queen with Eyes of Twilight was. Others might subconsciously assume this was a god on the same level as true god. But Klein knew that in the Second Epic, angels were equivalent to subordinate gods, which is why the ancient gods of the Second Epic had so many gods with different titles under their command. This Queen with Eyes of Twilight could be a true god, but she could also just be an angel. However, regardless, this organization had once killed an archbishop of the Storm Church, which meant they had at least demigod-level power. This still posed a huge threat to Klein, who was currently only Sequence 6. Ember glanced at him and said calmly, the Queen with Eyes of Twilight died long ago, and destined death has also been sealed for a long time. Dead. Klein was a bit stunned. That was a god. Just died. When did she die? Could it be that those so-called Skin Taker Messengers have been believing in a god who died long ago? That doesn't seem right. Or was this something that happened in the last few hundred years? Did she die because her name clashed with the Goddess of the Night, and the Goddess of the Night personally eliminated her? But that doesn't seem right either. Some details don't match, and there are time conflicts. The time Ember crawled out of the grave was roughly the same as his. Even with the backing of the Church of the Night, he wouldn't know about the Skin Taker Messenger unless he actively investigated. However, Ember seemed quite knowledgeable about the members of this organization, as if he had personally interacted with them. And judging by Ember's actions since crawling out of the grave, this was clearly impossible. So, is there a possibility? Ember interacted with this organization before coming to this world, which means that those Skin Taker Messengers and the Queen with Eyes of Twilight they believed in were not native to this world. Of course, this was just Klein's guess, he had no evidence. But if the Queen with Eyes of Twilight is dead, and the legend on Bansi Island is also true, that the Skin Taker Messenger were jointly wiped out by the two major churches, then no matter how glorious this organization once was, it cannot pose any threat to him now. After the two exchanged information, this brief meeting came to an end. Klein saw Ember off, was silent for a few seconds, and decided to do another divination. Bansi Harbor has danger. Klein held the pendulum and silently chanted. After repeating it again and again, he opened his eyes and found that the citrine pendant was still rotating clockwise, with a small amplitude and slow speed. It was the same result as before. There was danger, but not significant. Klein silently put down the pendulum, wrapped himself in spirituality, and fell into the gray fog. Back in the real world, Klein pressed the mechanical button on the toilet, put away the paper figure substitute, and went to the washstand next to it, turning on the water to wet his hands. In this short time, he quickly cleared his thoughts. Although the divination showed no danger, it was still better to be cautious. Avoid when possible, evade when possible, and prioritize stability. He pulled out a paper towel to wipe his hands, opened the door, and saw Danitz still standing in the center of the living room. Outside the window, a strong gale had started at some point, making the trees sway violently and even causing the ships to rock unsteadily. Seeing Klein come out, Danitz deliberately clicked his tongue in wonder. It really lives up to its name as a weather museum. This reminds me of a unique custom in Bansi Harbor. On nights with heavy fog and drastic weather changes, keep the doors tightly shut, do not go out, and do not respond to knocking sounds. Otherwise, Gannett said in a deliberately eerie tone, bad things will happen. Backland, William Street. In the evening, a door, emitting a faint blue illusory light suddenly tore open in a secluded alley on William Street. The door opened silently, and Ember's figure returned from the spirit world to reality. The entrance to the underground ruin was located in a mansion at 8 William Street, which once belonged to the Pound family. The so-called Pound family was actually a branch of the ancient Tudor family, who had to change their name to escape pursuit. But even after changing their name, this branch still remembered the glorious past of the Tudor family and never gave up on their desire to recreate that glory. Therefore, with the determination to make Tudor great again, they had been secretly searching for the secret ruins left by the Tudor Empire in Backland. The ruin beneath this mansion was their discovery. They built an absurdly large basement beneath the mansion to explore the area of the underground ruin. 30 to 40 years ago, they found the ruin and built a secret door leading to it. Of course, this entrance had been completely blocked. Klein bought 2 pounds of dynamite and completely blew up the entrance to the underground ruin. The owner of the mansion only thought that the underground ruin was old and in disrepair, so he didn't doubt its authenticity and didn't try to explore the underground ruin again. To avoid trouble, he also didn't tell anyone else about this underground ruin. With the help of the sleeping dragon crest ring, Ember did not alarm anyone. He easily sneaked into the mansion, passed through the living room, and followed the stairs down into a rather spacious basement. In a corner of the basement was a grayish-white stone door. It should have been integrated with the wall, but now it was exposed. Ember approached the stone door and, with a slightly heavy grinding sound, slowly pushed the door open a crack. A crack wide enough for one person to pass through. The sun beetle helmet on his head emitted a soft but dazzling light, illuminating the scene behind the door. It was a passage paved with dark stone slabs. There were several wooden doors on either side of the passage, leading to rooms on both sides. They were all tightly closed and had fresh marks, clearly having been replaced recently. Ember did not attempt to enter the rooms on either side of the passage but walked directly to the end of the passage. At the end of the passage was also a large pair of wooden doors. Creak. The wooden doors were slowly pushed open a crack, but the passage behind the doors was already blocked by earth and rubble, making it impassable. The existence of the wooden doors was just to conceal this pile of rubble, making it look less messy. The rubble blocking the passage was at least 10 meters thick, completely impassable for ordinary people. But for Ember, who possessed a teleportation ring, this was not difficult. The ring on Ember's hand emitted a faint blue and illusory light. This light came and went quickly. In just an instant, it disappeared, and Ember's figure disappeared with it. When he appeared again, he was on the other side of the pile of rubble. The light from the sun beetle helmet dispelled the surrounding darkness, allowing him to see everything around him clearly. This was a spacious hall. The area near the passage had partially collapsed, but the rear area remained largely intact. The style here was consistent with the passage outside, primarily using dark stone slabs, with 8 cylindrical columns of the same color standing tall. Metal rods hung down from the high dome ceiling, with candle holders carved into different creatures at their ends. Ding-a-ling. Amidst the crisp ringing sound, 3 tall figures wearing bright silver armor and horned helmets slowly emerged. The moment they appeared, they understood their duty and moved quickly towards the depths of the ruin with heavy steps. At the same time, the bell in Ember's hand was replaced by the twilight charm gifted by Ceres, and a heart-palpitating dark energy gathered in his palm. Snap. Sizzle sizzle sizzle. The dark energy turned into a stream of light and fell onto the ground in front, instantly exploding. The exploding black energy transformed into countless tiny beetles, covering the already dark ground and beginning to advance forward inch by inch, leaving no dead ends. As one of the few dark-type miracles, Doris's corrosion was quite effective in this enclosed environment. As they advanced, a platform half a meter above the ground appeared in Ember's line of sight. On the platform were 2 large iron-black chairs. Ember glanced thoughtfully at the 2 chairs and continued forward. He went all the way to the end of the hall, where there were 7 tall, heavy black stone doors. They were arranged in order, 2 on the left, 1 in the middle, and 4 on the right, perfectly conforming to the 4th epic's pursuit of asymmetry. Each stone door was engraved with different symbols and patterns. On the leftmost stone door, there was a deep black background, dotted with brilliance, surrounding a half-obscured crimson circle. That was the sacred emblem of darkness, the symbol of the goddess of the night. Grind. With a jerky, heavy grinding sound, the black stone door slowly opened backward. Under the illumination of the sun beetle helmet, the room behind the stone door was fully lit. First, there was an empty space several meters long and wide, also paved with dark stone slabs, followed by a platform nearly a meter high. On the platform was a huge statue, 4 to 5 meters long, almost filling the end of the room. It was a lady with a hazy but exceptionally beautiful face. She rested her right hand on her head, lying on the platform, wearing layered but not complex black classical robes. Beneath her head was a circle with radiating lines. On the lady's robes, there were shimmering points of light, which were bright and clear gem fragments, like the starry sky under the night. Amidst such contrast, the circle beneath the lady's head was like a full moon. Ember had seen this statue before, above the gray fog, in the scene materialized by Mr. World. This was the goddess of the night. For believers, carving the image of the goddess of the night was undoubtedly a blasphemy and distortion. But Ember felt that this was probably the true image of the goddess of the night. His only regret was that the lady's face was hazy, making her appearance unclear. But this was not strange, the people who carved these statues probably weren't qualified to see the goddess's appearance clearly. But based on her figure alone, Ember could not identify the goddess of the night. Chapter 190, Ember. 7 large doors. Inside the 6 large doors on the left and right sides, there is a statue placed in each, corresponding to the 6 true gods. The 2 doors on the left correspond to the goddess of the night and the Earth Mother, and the 4 doors on the right correspond to the Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, the war god, and the god of knowledge and wisdom. Except for the steam and machinery god, the 6 orthodox deities are all here. The reason for the absence of the steam and machinery god is also very simple. This true god is too young, and the time he became a true god may not be as long as the existence of this underground ruin. Zaw. With a grating and heavy friction sound, the stone door in the middle was also slowly pushed open. Behind the door was a passageway wide enough for 4 people to walk side by side. The front was dark, deep, mysterious, and eerie. But when Ember entered it, the dark and deep environment was immediately dispelled by the light of the sun beetle helmet. In the face of light, all shadows had nowhere to hide. It was precisely because of this that Ember could easily see the full view of this passageway. The end of the passageway was blocked by huge stones and earth, but on both sides of the passageway, there was a stone door of the same shape as the hall. The one on the right was half open and also filled with mud and stones. The stone door on the left was also not completely closed, leaving a narrow gap that allowed one person to pass through. Step, 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 rustle. Heavy footsteps and rustling but incredibly dense sounds rang out simultaneously. The Silver Knights and the summoned insect swarm surged into the room together, occupying all the space in the blink of an eye. Ember followed closely behind, and the light of the sun beetle dispelled the darkness, illuminating the black stone slabs in the room that were covered with dense beetle carcasses, and on the stone slabs were piles of white bones covered with decayed clothing. Obviously, this was left behind by those who had explored this underground ruin before. At the end of the room, a bloody double door stood tall. And most importantly, this door had already been opened. It was also only opened a crack, and it was also only wide enough for one person to pass through. A terrifying aura emanated from within, and it was this emanating aura that instantly killed the surging insect swarm. Although they were numerous, their individuals were especially weak. But for the Silver Knights, these auras were completely ignored by them. Because although the aura was terrifying, only the residual power remained. This also meant that the evil spirit inside this door had probably already escaped. Step, step. A Silver Knight suddenly rushed quickly towards the half-open bloody door, passing through the door and entering in the blink of an eye. However, the moment the Silver Knight passed through the door, a shadow flashed from the darkness behind the bloody door. Clang! Silver light and shadow intertwined, and in the echoing sound of metal collision, sparks of collision and friction erupted. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Ember also clearly saw the person who attacked the Silver Knight. It was a knight completely covered in armor, with a helmet that also had 2 horns. The style of his armor was clearly identical to that of the Silver Knights, the only difference being that his armor was black. Bang! Suddenly, the Silver Knight wearing bright silver armor flew out backwards, heavily smashing against the wall. And the knight wearing pitch black armor also slowly walked out from the bloody door, staring intently at the intruder outside the door. Black Knight. Ember looked at the tall figure that appeared before him and whispered. The Black Knights were once Silver Knights. They were the elite among the Silver Knights, serving the Sun King Gwyn. When Gwyn chose the transferring fire, most of the Silver Knights remained in Orlando, but as elites, they followed the king who transferring fire into the first fire furnace. Gwyn completed the mission of transferring fire, and the knights who followed Gwyn to transferring fire were burned to ashes, and since then they have become Ember, constantly wandering the world. In Ember's memory, he seemed to have never met Gwyn, and did not know what kind of person he was. But for the divine race, Gwyn was undoubtedly a qualified, god king. His sacrifice extended the rule of the divine race. And before Gwyn went out to transferring fire, He also distributed most of his power to the divine race, which further consolidated the rule of the divine race. But for the undead who were forced onto the path of transferring fire and accepted a mission that did not belong to them, this was undoubtedly a curse. Ember had never collected the ashes of the Black Knights, because they were already empty shells. Just like Ember himself, these Black Knights were also Ember, the remnants left behind when they were burned to ashes. In essence, they themselves were a kind of ash. Therefore, they, who were already ash, could not be turned into ash a second time. And it was not Ember who controlled the ash, but the fire. But the question is, why would the Black Knight appear here? The Silver Knights were able to live forever, because their corpses were made into ash by Ember and were summoned to this world by Ember. What about the Black Knights? Besides fire, who else could summon the Black Knights? Clang, clang, clang. The remaining 2 Silver Knights were already fighting with the Black Knight, silver light shining, and the sound of metal collision constantly echoing in the empty room. The Silver Knights and Black Knights, who were once from the same master, were now fighting to the death here. Perhaps fighting to the death is not appropriate, after all, they are already dead, and what is fighting here is just their ash. Clang 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 clang. Silver sharp lights appeared in different places as the long swords were swung, trying their best to cut the Black Knight's hard armor. But it was clearly a 2-on-1 fight for justice, yet the Silver Knights were slightly at a disadvantage. This is not strange, even though the Black Knight had been burned to ashes by the first fire, leaving only remnants. But in life, they were still the most elite knights in the divine race army. And these 3 Silver Knights in Ember's hands, they had not even followed Gwyn to participate in the war against the ancient dragons. They were born at the end of the divine race's rule, when the divine race was already crumbling, and even Gwendolyn was gradually being sidelined by the Pope. So don't expect these Silver Knights to have the same strength as the Silver Knights who fought the ancient dragons back then, they don't even have half of it. Whether it is strength or skill, they are too far behind the Black Knights who followed Gwyn to transferring fire and were burned to ash. If we classify the strength of extraordinary in this world, the strength of these Silver Knights in Ember's hands is between Sequence 5 and Sequence 4, stronger than Sequence 5 but not yet reaching the level of Sequence 4. And the strength of this Black Knight in front of us is between Sequence 4 and Sequence 3. Among all the Black Knights, his strength can only be considered at the bottom, but dealing with these Silver Knights is more than enough. Without external interference, the Black Knight would win completely even against 3 Silver Knights at the same time. Clang clang clang. In the intense metal collision, the silver light kept flashing. The Silver Knights wearing gorgeous bright silver armor seemed to have the upper hand. However, at some point, one of the Silver Knights suddenly stopped attacking, standing still as if in a daze. At some point, a pitch-black crack appeared on his forehead. This crack rapidly spread upwards and downwards, instantly splitting him into left and right halves. No blood gushed out from the crack, because the Silver Knights were also ash, they had no flesh and therefore would not bleed. And even with such a fatal injury, the Silver Knight was still alive. Having become ash, they had no concept of fatal injury. As long as their health bar had not reached the bottom, they would not die. But soon, more black light burst out from the Silver Knight's body, splitting his body into countless pieces like broken porcelain. Snap! The Silver Knight's body silently vanished, turning into ash in the blink of an eye and completely disappearing. Ember reached out his hand with a sense of understanding, and a square ash box silently appeared in his palm. This contained the ash of the Silver Knight. Generally speaking, Silver Knights would not die. Because what appears in the real world is only their soul, and their soul resides in the ash. Even if the soul is killed, for the Silver Knights, it is just the soul returning to the ash. As long as the ash is still in hand, they can be summoned repeatedly. Theoretically, this process is irreversible, and even an angel cannot truly kill the summoned soul. The ash is like some kind of anchor point, which can summon the soul residing within, and can also guide a part of their soul fragments back to the ash when the soul is killed. It only needs a period of nourishment, and when their soul has fully recovered in the ash, they can be summoned again. Of course, without external help, this usually takes a long time. And the stronger the strength, the longer the time required for recovery. But this time is different. The killed Silver Knight did not return to the ash box, his soul disappeared without a trace. In other words, that Silver Knight had been completely killed. A certain power resides within the Black Knight, and this power can sever the connection between the soul and the ash. When the soul completely dies, the Silver Knight's ash becomes a pile of real ash, with no value. And the power that killed the Silver Knight, Ember is almost too familiar with, that is the power called the First Fire. The Black Knights are the remnants burned to ashes by the First Fire, but they are also the agents of the First Fire's will. Clang, clang, Even though one Silver Knight had already died, the remaining 2 Silver Knights still fearlessly launched an attack on the Black Knight. A strong light almost simultaneously bloomed on their bodies, and that light formed a kind of invisible barrier, covering their already bright silver armor, making it look even more dazzling. This also gave them stronger defense, blocking the attack of the broad greatsword in the Black Knight's hand. Their Silver Knight swords were also covered by light at the same time, rapidly lengthening and widening under the convergence of light. From a standard straight sword, it transformed into a two-handed greatsword that was almost the same as the Black Knight's greatsword. And on that greatsword, there was also golden lightning entwined, which was from the divine race's oldest and most powerful miracle. Clang! The Silver Knight took a step forward, and with heavy footsteps, his two-handed greatsword, from top to bottom, slashed towards the Black Knight in a stance that could shatter buildings. The Black Knight was tall, but his movements were incredibly agile. He almost brushed past the greatsword, seemingly dangerous but easily dodging the Silver Knight's slash. Bang! The two-handed greatsword slashed into the ground, shattering the stone slabs and leaving a huge pit several meters deep on the black stone slabs that had existed for thousands of years. A large number of cracks quickly spread outwards, and the resulting depression even caused the Silver Knight to almost fall in. If he hadn't retreated in time and leapt up from the sunken ground. However, at the same time he returned to the ground, the Black Knight had already been waiting nearby for a long time. He dragged the heavy Black Knight greatsword, scraping the ground, leaving a terrifying scratch on the hard stone slab that scraped out sparks, and with an upward sweeping motion, swept towards the Silver Knight's waist and abdomen. This move was specifically prepared for opponents who liked to roll. The shield in the Silver Knight's hand reappeared, the light of the greatsword faded in the blink of an eye, and the two-handed greatsword turned back into a Silver Knight sword. But the light did not dissipate, but instantly converged on the small but exquisite shield in his hand. Endless light condensed from this, giving this shield terrifying defensive power. And at the same time, the other Silver Knight finally made his move. He held the sword hilt with both hands, bent his back, and plunged the greatsword straight down into the stone slab in front of him. In the sound of crackling, piece after piece of brilliant morning light surged out from the sword body, turning into a hurricane that swept the surroundings. Boom! The brilliant storm of light swept through the entire room, almost in the blink of an eye. The ground of the entire room was leveled by the storm, and the originally hard black stone slabs completely disappeared, revealing the earth below that was rolled up in the storm. And the Black Knight's figure was also stiffly kneeling on the ground, even the Black Knight greatsword in his hand had fallen to the side. He seemed to have fallen into some kind of stiffness. And taking advantage of this gap, the Silver Knight holding a sword and shield silently appeared behind the Black Knight. Bang! The Silver Knight sword pierced the Black Knight's hard armor and entered his body. But just like the Silver Knight, not a single drop of blood flowed from the Black Knight's body. They were both already dead, and everything they were experiencing now had no meaning to them. Bang! The Black Knight's body fell heavily to the ground, stirring up pervasive dust that obscured the vision. But he was unable to get up again, and silently turned into ash and disappeared. Open black lens bracket blasphemy card red priest close black lens bracket. ... The two Silver Knights simultaneously withdrew their gazes and walked step by step towards that bloody door. Ember calmly watched the place where the Black Knight finally fell. He had been watching from beginning to end, never trying to make a move. He didn't know why the Black Knight appeared here, or why he was involved with that evil spirit. If the Black Knight released the evil spirit, then why did the Black Knight stay put after the evil spirit escaped? This Black Knight was abandoned alone in this underground ruin, as if he was waiting here for him on purpose. From the moment he woke up, Ember knew very well that he had a mission. Transferring fire. This belief drove his actions in the initial period, constantly approaching the end with the Black Emperor as his goal. However, this goal was extremely empty from the beginning. The Black Emperor is undoubtedly an excellent kindling. But where is the furnace to light the kindling? And where is the first fire? If there is no furnace, how can you add fuel even with kindling? If there is no first fire, what is the point of adding fuel? All along, Ember had not been able to find any trace of the first fire. But now, he encountered the Black Knight in this underground ruin, a Black Knight who possessed the power of the first fire and was clearly controlled by the first fire. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.